I'm standing on the exact location of one of the most famous deaths of all time. A death that marked the end of the best-known battle in British history. Towards dusk on the 14th of October 1066, an unknown archer fired an arrow into the air from somewhere beyond those ruins. By chance, it came down straight into the eye of King Harold of England. This simple twist of fate changed our country forever. As a result, a horde of Normans led by William the Conqueror marched in and removed a whole way of life. Of course, William's propaganda machine ensured that all we ever get to hear about Harold is that he was the loser at the Battle of Hastings. But there's a hidden history, a tragic story of love, violence, intrigue, and cold hard cash. This is the real story of the last great Anglo-Saxon king. Tracking down the facts of Harold's hidden history means embarking on a quest across the length and breadth of Britain and over to the continent. Only by making this journey can we see how the events of his life conspired to set him on a countdown to the last fatal moment. It started here. This is Bozen on the south coast. Today, it's a picturesque little pleasure harbour. 1,000 years ago, it was a hub port for the Saxon territory of Wessex. Sometime around 1020, Harold was born and brought up here. The Saxon church where he would have gone to Mass still stands. We don't know when exactly he was born. The chroniclers thought all you needed to know about the young Harold was his second name, Godwinson. His father was the most powerful lord in the land, Earl Godwin of Wessex. Godwin had risen from the lowest ranks of the Saxon aristocracy and was a tenacious political fighter. He needed to be. These were turbulent times. A stone church like this was also used as a military building. For centuries, the tower had been used to watch out for Viking raiders coming up the Solent. But when Harold was a boy, the Danish Empire under King Canute had taken over the English kingship. Edward, the Anglo-Saxon heir, had fled to Normandy. Earl Godwin had survived the takeover, marrying a Danish woman and giving his 3 oldest sons Scandinavian names: Sweyn, Harold, and Tostig. Yes, our English hero was in fact half Viking. In 1042, Harold appears in the chronicles in his own right. In his early 20s, he got his first taste of power when the Danish Empire ended and the ancient English royal line was restored. Edward, who's known as the Confessor, returned in triumph from exile in Normandy. But with Edward came change. For the first time, he created a permanent base for the English monarchy here on the banks of the Thames just outside London at Westminster. But Edward was a new boy and a stranger in his own country. He may have come from a long line stretching right back to Alfred the Great, but he'd been brought up in Normandy. He needed the support of the Saxon earls, and in particular of Godwin, who ran Wessex. Edward bought Godwin's support. He married his daughter, Harold's sister, then cemented the alliance by giving Harold's older brother, Sweyn, an earldom in the Midlands, and appointing Harold as Earl of East Anglia. It made the Godwins the most powerful family in the land. Harold was the picture of a Saxon warrior, blonde, bearded, and now with wealth, influence, and his own retinue of personal troops. Harold and his family were loyal to the king. They served for long periods with the navy, protecting the English coast from raids. Edward felt no obligation in return. Like any new boss, Edward wanted his own people. So he started bringing in Norman nobles and giving them pockets of land. He also began replacing English clerics with Norman churchmen. These were people who wanted religious reform, but also had a political agenda. And the most dangerous of these was the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumièges.
It was said by a chronicler that Robert of Jumièges had such a hold over Edward the Confessor, he could point to a crow and say, "That crow is white," and Edward would agree with him. This guy was a schemer and a politician, and I believe that he was the prime mover in trying to badmouth Godwin and Harold and all the rest of the family in the eyes of Edward the Confessor, because there was so much mileage in it. If you could get rid of this most powerful family, you could leave the way open for the succession to the Duke of Normandy.
But this isn't just a political story, it's a personal one too. Harold's career may have been kick-started because his father was so powerful, but his downfall was because of his family as well. His whole story is a dynastic tragedy, and the course of the nation's history was changed because his family fell apart. The first source of tension was Harold's sister. Edward's marriage had failed to produce an heir, and in those days, the woman was always to blame. Edward couldn't annul the marriage because the Earl Godwin and his sons were still so powerful. But the lack of an heir created external pressure on the family. They might have survived if their internal stability hadn't been threatened by the behaviour of Harold's maverick elder brother. Sweyn was a typical rich kid gone wrong. He was a bully and a hellraiser. He was exiled in 1046 to Denmark for keeping a nun prisoner as a sex slave, and all his lands were divided between Harold and his cousin Bjorn. But in exile, he behaved so badly that eventually Denmark had him thrown out again. So 3 years later, he turned up in England begging Edward for forgiveness. Understandably, Harold was indignant. All this time, he'd been doing his duty serving his king as a naval commander. Why should he now have to give back his lands to an aristocratic wastrel? Supported by his cousin, for the first time, Harold stood up to his father. Family unity was beginning to crumble. On one side stood Godwin and Sweyn, on the other, Harold, his brothers and cousin. The Godwins were no longer invincible. Edward passed judgment. Sweyn was to sail from Bosom within 3 days or pay with his life. The rest of the Godwins were 70 miles along the coast. The matter seemed settled by the king's decision. As they waited in the shadow of the old Roman fort here at Pevensey, Sweyn turned up on horseback for one last appeal to his family to help get him reinstated. Somehow or other, he managed to persuade his cousin Bjorn to speak on his behalf to the king. Bjorn set off for Bosom with Sweyn and just 3 attendants. Sweyn was a psychopath with a grudge. We don't know what went wrong, but at Bosom, Sweyn had Bjorn tied up and bundled onto his boat. He killed his cousin in cold blood and dumped him in an unmarked grave. He'd gone too far. The sailors of the Royal Fleet declared him a Neathing, the Viking word for someone who's completely beyond the pale. Even Sweyn's own ships deserted him. He was forced to flee to England's enemies in Flanders. In spite of this universal condemnation, Earl Godwin lobbied for Sweyn's return. In 1051, he used his remaining shreds of influence to pressure Edward into allowing the murderer back. His return caused tension and resentment among other nobles who had to give back land.
Godwin had other families as rivals within England. Edward and he personally didn't like each other, that seems fairly clear. So there's a lot more personal animosity, rivalries within the kingdom at the back of all that.
The feuding Godwins had isolated themselves. Edward, encouraged by Robert of Jumièges, had the chance to reshuffle England's power base in his favour. he went in for the kill. Edward set a trap for Earl Godwin. He brought his brother-in-law Eustace over from Boulogne on the pretext of an official visit. At Dover, Eustace and his heavily armed men orchestrated a pub brawl that turned into a full-scale riot with deaths on either side. Dover was Godwin's territory. Edward gave the order for him to make an example of the town.
Godwin was faced with the choice of burning, looting and pillaging in his own homeland or disobeying the king. He chose rebellion and rallied his sons to try to persuade the king to change his mind at an emergency summit. But Edward had the support of the other barons, and when he refused to give the Godwins safe conduct to the meeting, they were forced to flee from the country.
The Godwin family sailed into exile. Harold's career seemed over. But Edward had underestimated the effects of this shift in the balance of English power. The rest of the earls realised that if the king could oust the most powerful family in the land, no one was safe. Messages of support started crossing the Channel, and 10 months later, the Godwins sailed back into London.
Harold and his father moored here at Southwark on the south bank of the Thames. Edward faced them across the river. In those days there weren't any bridges, so the Bishop of Winchester, Stigand, ferried back and forth, negotiating a humiliating climb down for the king.
The Godwins' lands were restored, and many of Edward's Norman cronies were forced out, including the scheming archbishop. It was victory.
Robert of Jumièges knew the game was up, and he fled immediately out of London before they came back to the court. And he killed several people on the streets before he left. This is the kind of churchman we're dealing with here.
Then, within 6 months, first Sweyn and then Earl Godwin died, leaving Harold as the new Earl of Wessex. Harold and Edward could now start with a clean slate, but the crisis of 1051 was to continue to haunt Harold. When he fled England, Robert of Jumièges had snatched Harold's youngest brother and a nephew as hostages. He handed them over to his new master, William, Duke of Normandy. The two young relatives languishing in a foreign dungeon were a time bomb that would eventually lead to Harold's downfall. Harold Godwinson had survived exile and crisis to become the most powerful earl in the kingdom. As Edward the Confessor's right-hand man, he commanded the army. He was about to face his first challenge. The Welsh were threatening to invade England. The border country of Hereford had always been vulnerable to attack. When Edward had brought Norman nobles to England, his motives were partly strategic. Over on the continent, the Normans had come up with the technology of the Motte Bailey Castle, an easily defended stronghold from which a lord and his men could dash out to give battle or retreat from an invading force without giving ground. The perfect answer to Welsh raids.
The Norman castellans brought their technology with them. This is one in Ewes Harold in Herefordshire. It actually became one of Harold's personal possessions. Most people around here aren't even aware that it was a castle. It's known locally as the Mound, but it's actually of a classic Motte Bailey design. They'd have flattened all the area around here, got all the earth, put it over there where the trees are, and then they would have protected this inner mound with a wooden palisade and also protected the outer ring round here with another palisade. So it would have been virtually impregnable. And if you look over there, you can see what a superb position it was in order to stop the Welsh from raiding in the Golden Valley below.
But King Edward had entrusted this key territory to a relative known as Ralph the Timid. The Welsh swept over the border, brushing Ralph's forces aside, overrunning Hereford and burning the Minster. was only one man to deal with the crisis: Harold. The Welsh campaign proved Harold's worth as a politician as well as a soldier. If you go to Hereford today, you can still see Harold's legacy in the layout of the old city. He negotiated a deal, giving land in return for a withdrawal from Hereford. He then set about strengthening the town, building moats and city walls. The restored walls surrounding the razor wire of Tesco's marked the course of Harold's defences. But Griffith, the Welsh leader, continued to cause trouble on the border. So at Christmas 1062, Harold decided to solve the Welsh problem once and for all.
Wales was Afghanistan for England. It was a really dodgy place to get into because the English had heavier armed troops. You could get bogged down in there and get picked off in ambushes.
Harold came up with a radical solution, the Saxon equivalent of a commando unit.
He decided the way to sort out Griffith was to make a lightning raid right into the heart of his territory. He first of all marched with lightning speed past Hereford and on to the west against Griffith's own castle.
I think one of the significant thing about Harold in Wales is it absolutely says that here was somebody who was an innovator of military tactics, somebody who knew that things had to change and you would adapt to circumstances.
When Griffith escaped, Harold launched a second phase. His brother Tostig continued raiding by land, while Harold sailed round the coast to destroy strongholds the Welsh thought were protected by the mountains. In the end, the demoralised Welsh signalled their submission by sending Harold the head of their leader. Harold was proving invaluable to King Edward, and he reaped the rewards of his position. His role as Earl of Wessex gave him estates throughout southern England. His Welsh success gave him land on the border as well. He was the equivalent of a multi-millionaire, and he lived the life. He loved the sport of hawking, which had the same sort of cachet as polo does today. He was famous for taking a hawk everywhere he went, and had Europe's finest collection of books on the subject. An 11th century man of means was expected to have a suitable wife, and Harold was no exception. Edith Swanneck was noted for her beauty. What was unusual for the time is that they also had a genuine relationship which lasted till Harold died.
As far as we can see, Harold had one of the real relationships of medieval history. There were probably others we don't know about, but certainly we know that Harold and Edith Swanneck were a very happy, if you like, a certain love affair.
In other matters, Harold followed the customs of the age. Rich men had a duty to fund religious institutions. Founding a church or abbey enhanced your earthly reputation and brought credit in the afterlife. King Edward, for instance, was spending a fortune on an abbey near his new base at Westminster.
Harold picked a project to rival the king's. He believed he'd been cured of some kind of paralysis when he prayed at the shrine of the Holy Cross at Waltham in Essex. It was here that he built Waltham Abbey, which gave its name to the town.
Today's church is half the size of the abbey in its heyday. Harold lavished money on the project, bringing back highly prized relics from trips to the continent, and providing costly fixtures such as a gold and marble altar, gospel books with silver covers, and a famous vestment embroidered with 8 kilos of gold thread. But just when it seemed that Harold had it all, he made the worst mistake of his life. The chronicles tell us that in 1064, Harold set off across the Channel from Bosham on a diplomatic mission to Normandy. The facts of the visit have been obscured by histories written after the Norman conquest. In order to justify William the Conqueror's invasion, they say that Harold was sent by King Edward to reaffirm a promise that William could be King of England after Edward's death. But this is Norman spin. Finding Harold's real reasons for sailing abroad involves a bit of detective work.
The official Norman version is this. In 1051, King Edward promises William of Normandy the throne of England. And in 1064, King Edward sends Harold over to confirm that promise. But what this official version conveniently forgets is that between these two dates, in 1056, King Edward also sent Harold over to Hungary on a long, costly mission in order to bring back a distant relative who he'd earmarked to succeed him. And this young man was still sitting around in the English court. The official version just doesn't wash. It seems much more likely that Harold went over to France on his own account, on a courageous rescue mission.
The hostages were the reason for Harold actually making his journey to Normandy. There was no reason to select an outsider, a foreigner, as king, one who probably would not have been accepted by the English nobility.
When Robert of Jumièges had fled back to the continent with Harold's relatives, he'd encouraged William of Normandy to believe that he'd been promised the English throne by Edward. 12 years later, Harold goes on what he thinks is a straightforward mission to negotiate the release of his brother and nephew, but he doesn't know about the promise to William.
He wasn't aware of the fact that William was ambitious to take control of England and was therefore waiting to exploit any opportunity to do so. Harold basically walked into a trap.
To find what happened next, you have to come here to Bayeux in Normandy to see a document made within a decade of Harold's visit.
This is where Harold's history starts to be told, not just in chronicles written down by monks, but in the first comic strip ever, the Bayeux Tapestry. It's an extraordinary piece of work. If you've only seen reproductions, you haven't got any idea of its scale or the detail of the embroidery. It's 70 metres long. It was originally commissioned to be hung in the nave at the cathedral here in Bayeux. And who made it? English seamstresses at Canterbury.
The tapestry shows that things went wrong for Harold from the start. He was blown off course, made a forced landing up the coast, and was taken captive by the local baron. The man who came to the rescue was William, Duke of Normandy. Harold was safe, but his bargaining power was destroyed. He now owed his life to the man who was to be his downfall at Hastings. Harold was out of the frying pan and into a blazing inferno.
In the year 1064, Harold Godwinson set out on a mission to rescue his brother and cousin who'd been given as hostages to William, Duke of Normandy. But his stay soon turned into something much more complicated and sinister. Half-honoured guest, half-prisoner, he was now a member of William's entourage and was reluctantly dragged round the ducal strongholds, like this one at Caen. Between William and Harold, there now began a subtle political game of cat and mouse.
You didn't keep the most powerful English earl a virtual prisoner unless you wanted something. Harold knew that he was part of a wider political agenda, hatched by a man who'd forged a reputation as one of the hard men of Europe.
His father died when William was a boy on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and he spent his formative years fleeing across Normandy with various tutors and uncles to actually keep alive. So by the time he got to 1820 and actually had rule of Normandy, he would have been quite a tough person. He had formed himself in a way that he brooked no opposition.
William had established a fearsome military empire. The Normans weren't French at all, but descended from Vikings. When Harold joined William on a campaign against the Duke of Brittany, it gave him a chance to assess Norman tactics and prove his own worth as a warrior.
The Normans were actually very impressed by Harold. William's force was crossing the River Couesnon, which flows into the sea at Mont Saint-Michel on the borders of Normandy and Brittany. And suddenly, Harold noticed that some of the knights were sinking in the quicksand. And quick as a flash, he wrapped his arms round the chest of one of them, yanked him to safety, then went back in and rescued a second one.
Harold's reward was being knighted by William, a double-edged sword that involved pledging obedience to his new lord. William's agenda was beginning to unfold. Then came the body blow. William brought Harold to the cathedral here in Bayeux. He demanded that Harold take a solemn oath sworn on sacred relics to support William's claim to the throne of England. Harold was under duress and swore with the 11th century equivalent of crossed fingers. Breaking an oath was monumental, and as far as William was concerned, Harold was bound by it.
Harold swore the oath, but in the full realisation that that was the only way he would escape, but knowing that he had no intention of actually supporting it later on.
Harold returned home knowing that his perjury would come back to haunt him. But even as he returned, another note was being prepared for his coffin. There was trouble again from within his own family. Harold's next brother down, Tostig, was Earl of Northumbria, governing the whole of the north of England. The region was wild and uncivilised, but it did have advantages. The Northumbrians paid half as much tax as anywhere else in England. Then Tostig made the fatal error of trying to put this right with a tax hike.
Harold and his brother would have known Lady Godiva. But unlike us, who only remember that she rode through Coventry in the nude, they would have remembered her famous ride as a tax protest to try to persuade her husband, the Earl of Mercia, to reduce the burden on his oppressed people. Tostig might have been well advised to follow Godiva's example, but he didn't. In one fell swoop, he doubled Northumbria's taxes. The king agreed, but the people of Northumbria didn't.
On the 3rd of October 1065, local nobles stormed Tostig's stronghold in York, looting his armoury and killing his men. They marched south, demanding a change of governor. Ironically, they wanted Lady Godiva's grandson instead. The rebels had got as far as Oxford when Edward put his top man on the case to negotiate. What Harold heard presented him with a dilemma. The choice was a civil war that would fatally weaken England, leaving her open to attack from William of Normandy, or abandoning his own brother. Harold chose country over family and recommended that Edward give the Northumbrians the leader they wanted. Tostig was outraged. He went into exile, vowing revenge on a brother who'd become his arch-enemy. King Edward never saw the consecration of Westminster Abbey. The nobility who'd gathered for the grand opening were to witness a far more important drama. Edward had fallen sick on Christmas Day. He swiftly deteriorated and died on the 4th of January. On his deathbed, he altered the succession in favour of Harold. The existing heir was too young, easy meat for William of Normandy. The English nobles were on hand to approve the dying king's wish. On the 6th of January, the new abbey witnessed two events: Edward's funeral and the enthronement of King Harold of England.
Harold Godwinson was the only man whom you could elect as king if you were in your right mind in England in 1066. Long before Edward died, they were expecting an invasion from Norway, a possible invasion from Denmark, and certainly an invasion from Normandy as soon as the old king died.
By the time news of Edward's death reached the continent, Harold's accession was a fait accompli.
William didn't take it well. He was out in the woods hunting when a messenger brought him news that Harold, his sworn man, had taken the crown for his own. They say he went straight home without a word and sat for hours with his head buried in his cloak. Harold stood with his forehead against a pillar, trying to cool the rage within. Then, when he'd recovered enough to speak, he called a council of war. This is Dives-sur-Mer on the mouth of the River Dives in Normandy. And here, 950 years ago, William started to build an immense fleet of 700 warships and transports in order to invade England. It was warfare on an industrial scale. They'd have chopped down around 60,000 trees and employed about 8,000 men. But more than that, the support structure to raise the cash and feed and water the workers would have involved everyone in Normandy. When William awoke from his rage, no one was left untouched.
The church at Dives has a list of all the nobles who sailed with William, but initially he had trouble recruiting. Many thought a campaign against the powerful English was suicide. What swayed them was religion. William managed to persuade the Pope that his invasion was a crusade against an English king who broke oaths and an archbishop who hadn't been properly appointed by the church. The Pope gave his blessing and allowed William to wear one of the perjured relics into battle. The doubters fell into line. Harold called out the English reserve and stationed them along the south coast. All summer they waited, while adverse winds prevented William's armada from sailing. Eventually, Harold disbanded the troops so they could go and get on with the harvest. And as soon as he did so, it came. An invasion. But not from the south. Harold's brother Tostig was out for revenge.
Tostig had already had one disastrous solo attempt, but now he joined his meagre force of 12 ships to the mighty fleet of the giant Viking, Harold Hardrada.
Hardrada had built up a reputation right across Europe as a ruthless warrior. Physically enormous, he brought with him 7,500 battle-hardened men. They sailed up the Ouse before going on to take York. King Harold's response was swift and fearless. He decided on the same sort of lightning strike that had paid off against the Welsh. He headed north, arranging for troops to meet him as he went, force marching 25 miles a day. It was a tremendous logistical feat. He had to march 190 miles up the Great North Road, which was little more than a cart track. On the 24th, he reached the outskirts of York. The unsuspecting invaders were waiting at the crossing of the River Derwent at Stamford Bridge. They were miles from their ships, and because it was hot, many had abandoned their armour. At dawn, Harold marched on York. The townsfolk flung open the city gates, and Harold's forces marched right through and on to Stamford Bridge, 6 miles beyond. As Harold arrived on the horizon, the invaders saw the Saxon weapons glittering like a field of broken ice.
The Norwegians were caught on the hop. Quickly, they moved back to the far side of the bridge to give themselves the chance of forming a decent defensive formation. The story goes that the entire Saxon advance was held up by one fearsome Viking who held the bridge single-handedly, killing 45 men until a crafty English spearsman waded out into the river and thrust upwards into the unprotected area underneath his chain mail. Then the English swarmed across the bridge and battle proper was joined in the old warrior tradition. 2 shield walls hacking at each other until a breach was made.
The front line would bend down. Then the next line are like this, and then the next line like that. So you've got a whole built-up wall of shields interlocking. The principal weapon is still always the sword, which can be used to strike over the shield wall, either cutting or thrusting. They would also use SWAT squads, and that's where you would get the famous two-handed axe. Hopefully punch a hole in the enemy shield wall, and then they could deploy back again inside their shield wall.
The battle was fierce, bloody and final. The survivors sailed off in just 24 of their original 300 ships. 60 years later, the piles of bones from the rotting corpses were still a local landmark.
Harold had won an extraordinary victory against one of the most renowned warriors of the age. Ever the diplomat, he allowed the remnants of the defeated Norwegian army to leave in peace, provided they promised never ever to return. They were true to their word, and Harold Hardrada's incursion was the last great Viking assault on Britain. In other circumstances, it would have ranked alongside Trafalgar or the Battle of Britain.
But the celebrations were short-lived. Devastating news arrived from the south coast.
There he was, feasting with his men, having fought off the most terrible threat to England. And then news comes that this guy from Normandy has landed as Pevensey. So it's like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You're almost there, win the next battle, and you not only have England secure, but you are the greatest king that ever ruled it.
So Harold rallied his weary troops and headed south to meet his destiny. At Stamford Bridge, King Harold had pulled off one of the greatest victories in British history. But 3 days later, William of Normandy landed at Pevensey, 250 miles to the south. Harold had another mountain to climb. William swiftly decided that the Pevensey marshlands were indefensible. He moved to the hilly country near Hastings. The next day, news reached him of Harold's great victory. Not wanting to make the same mistake as Hardrada, William decided to dig in near his ships and ravage the nearby countryside. The Bayeux Tapestry gives the first ever portrait of the effects of war on civilians. A mother and child flee as refugees from their burning home. Harold's determination and stamina were awesome. He left much of his tired northern force behind and set off with his corps professionals on the return journey south.
It's likely that William knew Harold Hardrada was setting out for the north of England, and although accounts will tell us that the winds didn't allow them to sail from Normandy when they wanted to, in actual fact they didn't sail until September, and that was a long time to wait for the winds. It's likely that William chose to wait, knowing that there would be an attack from the north, and then he knew already that the troops would have been weakened.
Harold rendezvoused with what reinforcements he could muster at a local landmark known as the Hoary Apple Tree. The next day would change its name forever to battle. Harold only had to survive the battle to leave William without reinforcements or escape. He took up the perfect defensive position on this hill. The abbey was built later specifically to mark the spot.
Harold had chosen his ground well. He lined his men up for about 200 metres in each direction. This wall was built to echo that formation. A shield wall, 4, 5, even 6 men thick. The king and his knights rode to the battle, but when they got here, they got off and took their place in the wall along with everyone else.
Harold probably used what was the most suitable, the most appropriate technology for Hastings. He was defending a hill. He was shutting off the road to London. He was essentially a defensive action.
At 9 o'clock in the morning, the battle started with the blast of trumpets. As the Normans struggled up the hill in their full armour, they could hear the din of the Saxons shouting and beating their shields with their weapons. And in the middle of them was King Harold with his battle cry of Holy Cross. First William's infantry, then his cavalry, broke against the shield wall like waves against a jetty. But the Saxons didn't budge. In fact, it was the Normans who broke first. A sudden panic by the men of Brittany on William's left flank spread throughout the entire army. Word had got round that William had been killed. A retreat started that threatened to become a rout.
The first time that Harold's wall broke and followed the Normans down the hill, arguably they thought the Normans were defeated, and arguably the Normans were defeated at that point. It was perhaps Harold's mistake that he didn't commit all his forces on that first retreat down the hill.
But it was only William's horse that had been killed. Realising the problem, he lifted his helmet so that his men could see that he was still alive. He rallied them and they regrouped. They cut off the pursuing Saxons, who formed a small defensive circle over there, where slowly they were hacked to pieces.
Because the horses were able to turn quickly and come back onto those men and wipe them out, maybe William then saw the advantage of this, because time and again William used it that afternoon and late into that evening. They would ride up to the shield wall and then feign going away, and they would be parting, and then turn quickly and come back onto the enemy and little by little cut down the Saxons.
In the 11th century, battles used to go on for 2 hours at most, but here they were, still fighting after 9.5 hours. And Harold was so close. Just another half hour and he would have won, because if night had fallen, then only he had the possibility for reinforcements the next day. But the tide was turning. As the Saxons retreated, the Norman cavalry got a purchase on the flat ground at the top of the hill. But the real key to the battle is given by all those tiny little archers who start to appear in the bottom margins of the tapestry at this point.
It was one arrow that really made a difference. When Harold was critically wounded in the eye, the Saxon cause was lost. The arrow didn't kill him. We know that this is Harold with the arrow in his eye, his name's printed overhead. But other accounts tell of cavalry riding in to finish him off. It seems that this whole scene is a storyboard. This is Harold. So is this. And if you think that the falling figure having his leg cut doesn't have an arrow, look again. The stitching's been removed sometime in the last 900 years. You can see the holes where the arrow once was. Harold's body was mutilated. The chronicles say his head was cut off, all of his right leg and half of his left. Anything of value was stripped from the corpses, who were left naked to rot, or in the case of the wealthy, to be rescued for burial.
The next day, this whole area was covered with hacked and dismembered corpses, stripped of their armour by bounty hunters. It was impossible to tell which one was Harold's, until Edith Swanneck, searching among the bodies, found him here. She identified him, according to the chroniclers, by certain marks on his body, presumably the intimate knowledge of a lifetime's love. Harold's mother offered his weight in gold for the corpse, a final proof of the Godwin's wealth. But William refused. The last thing he wanted was a Saxon cult building up round Harold's shrine.
The earliest accounts say that William buried Harold by the sea, but later tradition says that his body was taken to his own great foundation at Waltham Abbey. And that became the accepted burial place of the last Anglo-Saxon king. But now new evidence has emerged to challenge that tradition. A historian in Bosham, Harold's own home, has made a vital connection between the 11th century records and a local archaeological discovery.
The people of Bosham had always known that King Canute's daughter was buried in their parish church right here. But then in the 1950s, when some heating was being put in, they discovered another important tomb next to it, here.
Well, they opened up the tomb, naturally, and they thought it had been vandalised, quite frankly. And there was no head, and there was the right leg missing entirely, and 2/3 of the left leg was not there either.
But in the tapestry, there's only the one leg being hacked. You're talking about the head missing and the other leg.
There were two accounts that came out, one by the Bishop of Amiens, which described the injuries sustained by the body. That came out in about 1067, about only a year after the conquest. And there he gives exactly that description. The head was cut off, one leg was thrown away, and the tapestry completes the picture with the other leg being cut off. Hence, just a mutilated body. And then William of Poitiers also really confirms it. He said he was buried by the seashore. And what do we have here? The seaside.
Bosham became William's personal estate after the conquest. Here he could make sure that the grave didn't act as a focus of political discontent, while he set about the business of wiping out the Saxon aristocracy, introducing a new culture and a new language, and blackening the name of the defeated Saxon king.
I think that this country should erect a splendid monument to Harold. This was a man who defended England against overwhelming odds and who went down heroically, surrounded by his housecarls, fighting to the last man around their king. He was not a quitter, and we should celebrate him, and we should celebrate his Englishness and the achievement of 500 years of native English civilization, which stood for so much in medieval Europe, which had such a civilizing effect. And all of that is what Harold stands for. He stands for Old English valor, really.
I've been all over the country looking for the real Harold, and what I've found hasn't been a loser, but a charismatic leader who, if it hadn't been for a twist of fate, might well have ended up as a national hero in the same mould as Elizabeth I or Nelson or Churchill. But the arrow found its mark and the battle was lost. And in a way, England lost something too, because although there's no doubt that the subsequent blend of Norman and Saxon culture has given us a great richness and vitality, it also gave us a new aristocratic elite who spoke a different language and were completely cut off from the people who they were ruling. And 1,000 years later, that social gulf is still taking a long time to bridge. Anyone who's ever read a detective story knows that appearances can be deceptive. Just over 700 years ago, this innocent piece of land was witness to a brutal murder that changed the course of Scottish history forever. In May 1297, the Sheriff of Lanark, Sir William Heselrigg, was hacked to death here by a young Scottish patriot. His name, William Wallace, or as we've come to know him, Braveheart. Wallace was a legend, a national hero. But I've come here to try to find the man behind the legend.
If you've ever watched the movie Braveheart, forget it. It's a great piece of entertainment, but not an accurate guide. I've come to central Scotland to find the truth about Wallace. Underneath schools and factories and housing estates lies a trail of blood. But whether it leads to a hero or a villain depends on where you come from. Wallace was the first Scottish champion in the vicious wars of independence from England. He's a Scottish icon to this day, but he was certainly no saint.
Wallace was a freedom fighter par excellence and was there for his country when his country needed him.
He is accused of getting choirs of naked Englishmen and women to sing for him. This was particularly dreadful.
He was an underdog, a second son of an unimportant knight, and yet he had something in him which people responded to.
He must have been an extraordinary man. We should never have heard of William Wallace.
And we might not have done, except for an accident of history. When Wallace was born, there was no war with England. Scotland was prosperous. Life was good. Then, disaster struck. The night of the 19th of March 1286 was stormy. The Scottish King Alexander III had been carousing at a function in Edinburgh Castle. Late at night, and probably the worse for wear, he ignored his courtiers' advice and insisted on returning home to Kinghorn on the other side of the Firth of Forth. He just married a beautiful French princess half his age. In driving rain and pitch darkness, he set off along the coastal path for his marriage bed.
But whether it was a midlife crisis or a noble desire to perform his kingly duties, it was the death of him. Somewhere along the way, his men lost him and his horse stumbled and fell. Later on, he was found here, with his neck broken. 600 years later, the Victorians put up this monument to mark the event. It says, without a hint of irony, that it was erected on the sexcentenary of his death. Seldom has libido proved so costly.
When Alexander's only heir also died, Scotland was thrown into crisis. Powerful rival factions took to arms, and the country slid towards civil war. Without a leader, it was going to be chaos.
A king is going to have to be chosen. Now, in theory, God chooses kings, but in this case, there's going to have to be some sort of earthly intervention. It couldn't happen within Scotland because that would imply the Scottish nobility are superior to the king. It's got to be a great international figure. And Edward I, Scotland's nearest neighbour, great reputation in Europe, he's the man to do it.
They'd asked the wrong man. Edward I was a ruthless expansionist. He'd already annexed Wales and Ireland. The crisis gave him the chance to bring Scotland into his empire. Under the pretext of preventing civil war, Edward took control of Scotland. At Norham Castle, he made the Scottish nobles acknowledge him as their feudal overlord, the medieval equivalent of mafia dons acknowledging a supreme boss. It meant that when John Balliol was named king, he was Edward's puppet. But while the Scottish nobles caved in, the common people remained defiant. Resistance leaders emerged from nowhere. Throughout Scotland, there were spontaneous attacks on the hated occupying forces. It's about this time that tales of a fierce young Scot called William Wallace began to circulate.
One typical story has Wallace fishing in a river when suddenly 5 English soldiers turn up and demand his catch. And Wallace says, "You must be joking," but offers them half anyway. And one of the English soldiers is so furious that a mere jock should give him cheek that he draws his sword and lunges at Wallace. Wallace immediately parries with his fishing pole, snatches the man's sword and lops his head off. Then he kills 2 of the other soldiers before the others escape.
Who was this Wallace, everyone was asking? We still don't know what he looked like. These pictures are from much more recent times. The only clues we have to his appearance are the accounts which tell of an arrow scar on his neck and a general agreement that he was enormous, perhaps 6'6" or more. He was also much younger than this, about 26. But where had he come from? Well, a Scottish chronicler called Blind Harry tells us that the de Wallace family, which means they were originally from Wales, settled in Elderslie, just south of Glasgow. On the flimsiest of evidence, the good old Victorians did what they do best and erected a monument. But now, archaeology has backed up tradition.
So what would have been on this site when Wallace was alive?
Well, this is the site where Wallace first saw the light of day, and there would have been a fortification here. There was an archaeological dig done in 1998. There's a hedge that runs right round the site here, and it shows the outline of the original wooden palisade that would have surrounded the fortified property.
When you say fortified property, what would it have looked like?
There would have been a hall house of some sort, either made of timber or stone, surrounded by a wooden palisade. And this path that we're actually walking on at this moment actually is on the site of the ditch. As I say, there was a dig done here in '98, which I saw, and the ditch still actually exists. It's carved out of solid stone, and it's right under this path in which we're walking right now.
So what does that mean about Bruce's family, about Wallace's family?
Middle class, I would say. If you were looking at it in a sort of modern term, you would say middle class, upper middle class perhaps.
So in 1270 it would have looked something like this. On the raised ground was the northeastern corner of a fortified hamlet run by the Wallace family. They were minor nobles descended from the Norman aristocracy, and although they would have thought of themselves as Scottish, they would probably still have spoken French within the family. But here's the weird thing. The only record of Wallace's youth tells us that he was taught by monks and was going to be a priest. It's possible, because the church was a traditional option for minor nobility without land to inherit. But the only physical evidence we have suggests Wallace was embarked on a less pious career.
We know from the seal that was discovered a few years ago that has a bow in the middle of it, that Wallace probably saw himself first and foremost as an archer. Now, that probably didn't mean he was a soldier necessarily. It may have been a bit on the poaching side of things, on the hunting of deer. But yeah, he would have had to make his own way. He wouldn't have any lands given to him, and I don't think there's any evidence. In fact, it's pretty clear he didn't have any lands himself, so he's got to make his own way.
It's likely then that Wallace was a bit of a tearaway, who came good when history gave him a cause. Once Edward I had his hooks into Scotland, he never gave up. In 1296, after repeated humiliations, his puppet king John Balliol rebelled. The Scots assembled an army and raided northern England. It was just the excuse Edward was looking for. He marched north.
This is Berwick-on-Tweed. Today it's in England, of course, but 7 centuries ago it was one of the most important and prosperous towns in Scotland. As Edward moved forth, spoiling for a fight with the rebellious Scots, the people of Berwick gave him the perfect opportunity for one. Some English merchants had been murdered here and their goods pillaged by the locals. Edward decided to make an example of them.
The massacre that followed shocked even the partisan English chroniclers of the time. Edward unleashed thousands of trained killers on an unsuspecting band of lightly armed civilians.
There wasn't much resistance. You see that Land Rover over there? Well, just beyond it, there was a building called the Red Tower, and some Belgian merchants holed up there, firing arrows, and they killed Edward's cousin. So eventually, he personally ordered their deaths by having them burnt alive. But it wasn't just Edward who wanted blood. Soon the cry rang out from the whole army, "Havoc, havoc," which means plunder, plunder, and it's where we get our word havoc from. There would have been mayhem. The men would have been automatically killed, the women raped first. The chronicles say the slaughter lasted 3 days and only stopped when Edward saw one of his men hacking a woman to death as she was actually in the process of giving birth. They say that half the population of Berwick was slaughtered and that the River Tweed ran red as the bodies piled in.
The massacre at Berwick was just the beginning. Edward crushed the Scottish army, shut up John Balliol in the Tower of London, and took the Stone of Destiny, the symbol of Scottish kingship, back to Westminster, where it remained for 700 years. It seemed like total capitulation.
The story goes that when Edward was leaving Scotland, he turned to the Earl he was about to put in charge and said to him, "Bon besoin fait, qui de merde se délivre." In other words, the guy who gets rid of shit is doing a really good job. Edward thought that he'd got rid of the problem of Scotland. He thought that by conquering the nobles, he was conquering the people. But he was wrong, as William Wallace was about to make very clear. Edward I thought he'd taught the Scots a lesson. But the slaughter at Berwick had exactly the opposite effect. All over the country, spontaneous opposition broke out. Then, in 1297, William Wallace burst onto the scene. But according to the chronicles, it wasn't the public atrocities at Berwick that brought him into the limelight, but a private grudge here at Lanark.
The chronicles tell the story of how Wallace fell in love. He saw a maiden at Mass here in St Kentigern's church and was instantly smitten. She was Marion Braidfoot from nearby Lamington. The story goes that Wallace carried on a clandestine love affair and eventually married Marion. But the English sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg, also had his eye on Wallace's girl. When Wallace got into a skirmish with Heselrigg's men, before they could arrest him, Marion helped him escape into the hills. In revenge and full of lustful hate, Heselrigg had Marion killed. Hearing of the slaughter, Wallace returned under cover of darkness to wreak his revenge. There's hardly anything left of Lanark Castle today. Lanark Thistle Bowling Club occupies the site of Heselrigg's stronghold.
Heselrigg wouldn't have expected Wallace to return, but he did. In May 1297, he and his men probably slipped into town in ones and twos and then joined up, ready for their revenge. The attack was swift and terrible. Wallace went straight to the sheriff's house, surprising him in his bed. One blow of his enormous sword went straight through the sheriff's skull, down to his collarbone. Death would have been instantaneous, but a young follower made sure by stabbing the inert body 3 times. Then the Scottish raiders went on the rampage, killing the English at will, sparing only women and priests.
The killing of Heselrigg is the first documented reference we have of Wallace, but the love story may well be fiction. After all, Wallace was an outlaw and the sheriff was the local judge. Maybe Wallace simply killed him to avoid prosecution for some other crime.
It could be that he was already beyond the law, that he was a kind of an outlaw. If he'd been poaching, he may even been beyond Scots law. And maybe he was someone on the wrong side of the tracks who sort of made good because war broke out.
And because of his success, legends stick to Wallace like glue. He's an archer and he kills the local sheriff. Now, at that time, stories of other fugitive noblemen like Robin Hood were hugely popular. We know that Wallace's maid Marion only appears in later versions of the story. Maybe the chroniclers wanted to turn Wallace into a Scottish version of Robin Hood, and so they gave Wallace his maid Marion too.
And while we're on the subject of myths and legends, this is probably a good time to admit that Wallace was never called Braveheart. That's the name that belonged to that other Scottish hero, Robert the Bruce, after he died, when his brave heart was put into a casket and carried into battle. Sorry.
Wallace's slaying of the Sheriff of Lanark made his reputation. People started flocking to his cause. The outlaw band became a militia and then an army. And at its head, a nobody from Elderslie.
Well, that's it. That's the key to it, isn't it? It's the personality of Wallace. I mean, he must have been an extraordinary man. We should never have heard of William Wallace, and we wouldn't have done if it wasn't for this war. He obviously had leadership qualities, but I think he also had that single-mindedness, that devotion to a cause, one cause, which in this case was Scottish independence, that meant that he would, there was no other way for him. And I think he's just one of these extraordinary people in history that do extraordinary things by their own personality, not by the situation that they found themselves in.
But Wallace wasn't alone. In the Highlands, a young nobleman called Andrew Murray had been fighting an equally successful guerrilla campaign. When Wallace joined forces with Murray, the rebellion became a revolution. The English had to act. Edward I, who was away fighting in France, ordered a formidable army north to sort out the rebels. Barring their way to the Highlands was the mighty River Forth. Wallace and Murray decided to take the English on at the crossing point. Its name was to echo in history. Stirling Bridge. In 1297, the bridge held the key to the strongholds in the Highlands, graphically demonstrated by this 13th century map. If the English were going to take Scotland, they had no choice but to cross. Wallace and Murray decided that a battle at Stirling Bridge was their best chance of defeating the mighty English army. But it wasn't this Stirling Bridge. Amazingly, the exact location of Wallace's greatest triumph was a mystery until recently. Nobody could find the foundations of the original bridge. Find them, and you find the battleground. Then amateur archaeologists decided to test a local tradition that the bridge lay upstream from today's with some homegrown technology.
I don't understand how you ever managed to see those pillars under this water. It's pretty murky, isn't it?
Well, it is pretty murky, but there are times of the year when the fresh water's coming down and you can see. We used an old method that the pearl fishers used, which was to make a bucket out of wood with a glass bottom, and they could see the freshwater mussels on the bed of the river. Sorry, Claire. And if you like to have a little look over the side,
this is it.
This is it. This is the.
It's high tech, isn't it?
Oh, it is. It is. It is. But it's very effective. And on a sunny day, if you put your head right and exclude the light from around the edge, it's you can get a marvellous vision of the riverbed.
So I should be able to see one of the piers down here somewhere.
Yes, yes.
All I can see at the moment is my own face looking back at me. I've got it. I think this is it. Yep. Wow. Very effective. Oh.
A simple solution to a problem.
It's quite gruelling, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's not very easy to use, but.
River Vision Mark II. Should patent this. You might make a fortune.
Yes, but I never thought of that.
The ancient town seal from Wallace's time shows a flat wooden platform on top of 8 stone piers. Everyone had been looking for a bridge that went straight across the river, but you don't need 8 piers for a straight bridge. What they discovered was that the piers went across the river diagonally. No one knows why, but it means that the number of piers fits perfectly for a bridge that looked something like this. This narrow structure was a key part of Wallace's plans. The Scots had positioned themselves on the high ground on the north side of the river. In 1297, this is what Wallace might have seen. He and his lightly armed foot soldiers would have had a clear picture of the task that faced them. Looking south to the river, they could see the English as they prepared for battle in the shadow of Stirling Castle. Accounts say that the English had brought 1,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry to face the spears and dirks of the rebels. They outnumbered the Scots by as much as 10 to 1. Wallace's men knew it was make or break.
The English army at that time was regarded as the mightiest fighting machine in Christendom. Wallace must have been a dynamic leader to have instilled in his men the belief that they could win. not just against superior numbers, but against much more superior armaments, horses, weaponry, even money when it comes down to it. And even although they were outnumbered, Wallace used the land of Scotland itself to help.
The Forth looped round, leaving an area of boggy ground between the English and the Scots. This was crossed by a single raised causeway that followed the same course as the road does today. The bridge and this narrow road caused a bottleneck. The logistics of getting the sheer numbers onto the field of battle would have made for a scene like the start of the London Marathon. It made some of the English knights nervous, but as the nobles discussed tactics, the tide rose, making the marshland even boggier. Delays and indecision were to prove fatal.
3 times the English started across the bridge and 3 times they drew back. Dominican friars were sent across to offer Wallace peace terms, but the message came back, "We have not come for peace, but to avenge our country." The upstart was spoiling for a fight, and the English were happy to oblige. Wallace and Murray couldn't believe their luck. The enemy was about to fall into their trap.
The narrow bridge could only take 2 horses at a time. As the heavily armoured mounted knights rode off the causeway to form a battle line, the ground became too boggy for an effective charge.
The English were probably expecting the Scots to wait till they'd all processed across the bridge and lined up nicely. That was the etiquette of chivalry. But Wallace and Murray weren't like that. They were street fighters, engaged in a last-ditch attempt to save their country. They waited until just the right amount of Englishmen had crossed, enough to fight and enough to kill, and then Wallace gave a single blast of his horn. The Scots rushed out from their stronghold on the high ground beyond where that white bungalow is. They attacked on both flanks and they cut off the English retreat back to the bridge. With no room to form up and completely unable to manoeuvre, the English were stuck. The Scots slashed at the hamstrings of their horses and stabbed at their underbellies, and as the horses fell, the English were dead meat. It was carnage.
The chronicles report 5,000 English dead. The victory was against all odds. Native cunning and spirit had defeated numbers, money and equipment. The English retreated in disarray. To this day, Stirling Bridge is symbolic of an unbreakable sense of national pride, whatever the southern neighbours may do. And on the very turf where Wallace's men splashed through the mud to bring down the English cavalry, a new generation of warriors struggle for pride and glory.
A bit too low. Break up. Less than that. There is a sense of history here. I mean, I believe it because I'm also the history teacher as well as the rugby coach, but I sense, and I think the boys feel too, that this is an ancient place. It's surprising, when you tell the story of the battle, you could hear a pin drop, because there's a sense of pride, there's a sense of achievement that you can sense among the pupils. Sure, you lose the atmosphere a bit later, but for that moment, there's something in them that they just feel, hey, yeah, we did this here.
William Wallace was a national hero, but he was now on his own. His partner, Andrew Murray, had been one of the handful of Scottish casualties. Nevertheless, the Scottish tales were up. Wallace decided to take the battle to the English. What was William Wallace really like? Well, to the Scots, he was the hero of Stirling Bridge, the 27-year-old victor of the hated English. With his partner, Andrew Murray, dead, Wallace got all the glory. And that success makes the real man harder to find. The ballads and myths started almost at once. The Scottish chronicles are more celebrations of a legend than objective histories.
I think there are various reasons why Wallace is a legend. Wallace represents Scottish national resistance in a most extraordinary way. I mean, this was a man who absolutely turned the tide. The English seem to have dealt with Scotland in 1296. The Scottish nobility had capitulated. John Balliol, the king, had miserably abdicated. And this nobody arose, and Scotland rose with him, and that is a tremendous achievement. There's no doubt of that.
But anyone who's ever watched a football match with rival fans knows there are always two ways of looking at any incident. The English hated Wallace. To them, he was a terrorist who'd broken the chivalrous rules of war. In football terms, he'd taken the penalty before the keeper was ready. And what happened next seems to confirm that Wallace had a much darker side. Buoyed with his success at Stirling, Wallace swept into northern England. It was time for the Scots to vent their fury. The English chronicles are full of stories of Wallace's savagery. He put monasteries to the torch and laughed as monks were drowned in front of him. He slaughtered women and burnt schools with the school children inside. Rape, torture and atrocity marked his progress through the borders. He shocked an age hardened to brutality. The stories evoke contemporary parallels.
The English accused Wallace quite explicitly of effectively ethnic cleansing, that his intention was to get rid of everyone that spoke English from the north of England.
Even the Scottish chronicles realised there was a problem. They said he tried to prevent the excesses of his men, defending priests at the altar. On the other hand, they made no bones about his hatred of all the English. So was Wallace a national hero or a war criminal? The National Wallace Monument is the great Victorian expression of his legendary status. It dominates the landscape of Wallace's great triumph at Stirling. Braveheart fans and Scots from all over the world, including the South Florida branch of the Stuart clan, come to pay homage. But even here there's a grim recognition that there was little room for compromise in medieval warfare.
And the said Provenance executioners would then put this through the back or the front of the head. And that is your cranial spike.
If you knew Wallace as a person, he probably wasn't the sort of guy you would like to get on the wrong side of. He was probably terrifying. There was probably an awful lot of people in Scotland that were either feared him or hated him at the time. We see him as a national hero and we see him differently. But Wallace's one major inherent strength was he killed Englishmen wherever and whenever he found them. That was his job, and that's what he did.
Not to be confused with your dispatching dagger, which has two sharp edges, one to the left and one to the right.
Essentially, Wallace was a man of his day.
Putting the mortally wounded out of their misery by impinging...
There's no doubt that he was a very bloody, violent man, living in a violent age. And he stood no nonsense at all from enemies and butchered them as soon as look at them. But at the same time, here's a man that was a leader. He was an underdog, a second son of an unimportant knight, and yet he had something in him which people responded to. And he led them, he had a vision, he was true to his king, he was fighting for John Balliol, he had loyalty, he had a sense of purpose, a sense of achievement, he had a brain that could think of strategy. No, I think there are many good aspects of Wallace's personality and character which you can focus on, but we try to sort of say that those days are gone now when we want to slaughter the English.
On his return from his campaign of terror along the English borders, Wallace was knighted, possibly by Robert the Bruce. Then Sir William Wallace was made Guardian of Scotland. In the absence of the king, he'd been given absolute power. Wallace knew the English weren't beaten. He began preparations at once for the defence of the realm. He put a gibbet in every major town to deal with backsliders. Another sign of his ruthlessness, perhaps, or just a desperate recognition of the scale of the expected English response.
Pretty soon the king realised that if he wanted a job done properly, he was going to have to do it himself. Next time Wallace met the English army, it would be led by King Edward.
The English wouldn't be fooled by another surprise attack. So to prepare for a clash with the heavily armoured English cavalry, Wallace invented a battlefield tactic called the schiltrom. The outnumbered ranks of infantry would form an enormous circle of spears, so that the charging knights would be met by a deadly giant hedgehog. As a massive English army advanced from the south, Wallace retreated, burning fields and crops as he went. His plan was to use a scorched earth policy to break the English lines of supply. It nearly worked. As the English army lumbered on, getting hungrier, there was no sign of the enemy. Then, at Edinburgh, a scout reported that Wallace was just 20 miles away in Falkirk, ready to pounce if the English retreated. Edward ordered a forced march. At dawn, on the 23rd of July, 1298, the English luck changed.
The chronicles tell us that as the English army was advancing up the Forth, they saw a flash of armour up here on the hill. It was Wallace spying on his enemy. But by the time an advance guard had raced up here, he was gone. Instead, down there, in front of the town of Falkirk, they could see the entire Scottish army preparing at last for battle.
No one knows why Wallace chose to stand and fight. The English were almost out of food and ready to retreat. Perhaps he thought he might be overtaken and preferred to choose the battleground. Or perhaps Stirling had made him overconfident. Either way, the Battle of Falkirk was to be crucial. And yet, incredibly, no one's sure where it took place. The scraps of information we have from the chronicles just refer to a hilly area overlooking boggy ground and a watercourse. It could have been the town's centre site where the park is today. The rise just beyond the supermarket. The farmland under Callender Woods. Or here, the Mumrill site near the main Edinburgh-Falkirk road.
Whatever the location, we know the story of the day. Wallace had his men arranged up on the high ground with 4 large circles of spearmen, and in between them he had his short bowmen, and behind his cavalrymen ready to charge. "I've brought you to the ring," he said to his men. "Now dance as best you can." The English sent wave after wave of cavalry across the boggy ground, up the slope and onto the waiting Scottish spears. But then 2 things happened that changed the course of the day and the future of Wallace's reputation. Firstly, the Scots nobility who made up their cavalry suddenly upped and left, and secondly, the English brought on their new secret weapon, the longbow.
The longbow's range was deadly. Some thought it went against the rules of war, as horrific in its time as napalm, as effective as a machine gun. Wallace escaped with his life. 10,000 of his men didn't.
To be fair to Wallace, he had planned his strategy around what the English normally do, which is a major cavalry charge, and that's why you've got the schiltroms, this hedgehog of spears. And he had trained his men well on this, and they'd been practicing for quite a while. But what he couldn't have foreseen really was that Edward would deploy the archers in the way that he did. And this is the beginning of the rise of the English archer to such a preeminent position in the 100 Years' War against France in the next century. They're going to win battles, and poor old Wallace was on the receiving end of that. He had planned it, it's just that technology took over.
For people who know the movie, it may come as a shock to know that Falkirk wasn't the end for Wallace. He was to carry his fight on for 7 more years, before his horrific betrayal and death. Falkirk was annihilation. Wallace escaped with his life, but a reputation in tatters. His loyal foot soldiers had been slaughtered by English bowmen, and if Blind Harry's to be believed, his cavalry had simply deserted him. Sir John Graham was one of the few nobles who stayed at Wallace's side. His remains lie in Falkirk graveyard, one of only 3 marked graves from 10,000 dead.
Wallace didn't just fight the English, he also fought the threat from his own nobility, possibly because of his low-born status, or low-born compared to the great earls of Scotland, who were jealous of Wallace's sudden high standing in the community.
What are you going to do? Are you going to stay there and die, or are you going to go away and live to fight again? I mean, it's all very easy for us 700 years over to say, oh, it was a dreadful thing. I don't think the Scottish cavalry could have won that battle. No, they couldn't have done it. So I think they very wisely said, let's go regroup, try and think again.
So you don't think the cavalry betrayed?
No, I don't. I think they very sensibly saw the way things were going. I mean, there's nothing they could have done. What are they going to do? Ride down that hill into the cavalry and be completely massacred? We've got to remember Wallace himself survived the Battle of Falkirk, unlike a lot of the men in his schiltrons.
Demoted from his role as Guardian of Scotland and with his troops decimated, it seems Wallace returned to the land he knew best, hiding out in the forests of Selkirk while he regrouped. Edward I had battered the Scots into military submission. When Wallace re-emerges, it isn't as a soldier, but as a diplomat. While he was Guardian, Wallace had been used to playing on the international stage. While so much else has been lost, incredibly, we have one of Wallace's own letters. He was writing to the merchants of Lübeck in Germany, basically saying that Scotland was open for business. Now, in the wake of military disaster, it seems Wallace took the political initiative against the hated Edward. Another letter, which has since been lost, shows that Wallace made journeys to the King of France and to the Pope to try and win political support. It was the equivalent of an appeal to the United Nations of the time. It was a unilateral action, not backed by the nobles, who were trying to appease Edward while they consolidated their position. So do you think that in his later years, Wallace would have been a bit of a political loose cannon, like Edward Heath or Arthur Scargill?
I think loose cannon is exactly the way to describe Wallace. Although he does, when he comes back from the continent in 1303, he does join with the rest of the Scottish nobility. He's one of the leaders of the Scottish army, and that's quite interesting. He's one of many. But when the Scots decide, when John Comyn of Badenoch is the sole guardian at that period, that Scotland has had enough, that perhaps they should submit to Edward, whether they thought this was only a temporary measure or not, Wallace would not submit. He's not the only one, but he's the main one. And I think most of the Scottish nobility and the Scottish people, it's not just the nobility, a lot of the Scottish people had had enough as well. They would have thought, oh, shut up.
But Wallace wouldn't shut up. He fought on in the way he knew best, as an outlaw. While everyone else, including Robert the Bruce, went with the flow, Wallace kept one step ahead of the law. He went straight to the top of Edward's most wanted list.
The shocking thing was, when the end came, that it wasn't an Englishman that captured Wallace. He was actually betrayed by a Scot who was an English pay. But an awful lot of the problems in Scotland down the century were succinctly summed up by Robert Burns, who said, "We are bought and sold for English gold."
In 1305, Wallace was finally betrayed to the English. By this time, most of Scotland's nobles were back under Edward's rule again, and one of his tests of their loyalty was whether or not they were prepared to try to capture Wallace. But eventually the betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. The man chosen to close the trap round him was Sir John Menteith, a particular friend of Wallace's, who was godfather to his 2 children. They surprised Wallace here at Rob Royston, just outside Glasgow. There was a struggle. Eventually Wallace was subdued and dragged south of the border to avoid any possibility of rescue. 17 bruising days later, he arrived in London. On the 23rd of August, Wallace was brought before the King's Bench at the Royal Palace of Westminster. This was once the largest freestanding building in Europe. In 1305, it was the intimidating setting for a show trial. Wallace stood silent, facing his accusers, as charge after charge was read out. He only spoke once, when accused of treason against Edward. He shouted out that he could never have committed treason, as he had never given his loyalty to anyone but the rightful King of Scotland.
But in the end, the odds were stacked against Wallace. The trial was more about humiliation than justice. As he stood on this spot, the sentence for treason was declared. Wallace was to be hung, drawn, and quartered. Stripped naked, and with his feet tied to the tails of two horses, he was dragged through the city of London. His head banged against the cobbles. The London crowd pelted him with filth. Miraculously, when he arrived here, he was still conscious. In those days, this was known as Smoothfield. It was just outside the city walls. Today, we know it as Smithfield, the site of the famous London meat market. And here, just round the back of St Bart's Hospital, they butchered William Wallace.
Now, in Wallace's case, of course, in his hanging, he'd be dangling there, suffocating, going purple in the face, eyes starting out of his head, bloodshot, struggling, arms and legs jactitating. He'd probably be incontinent of urine and feces, stool. Now, this required great skill on the part of the executioner because he's got to cut him down while he's still conscious. Drawn, he'd slash open your belly with a knife, pull out your guts, pick up his knife and crudely hack it away. Toss the guts onto the fire. If he was still the slightest bit alive, he might smell his own intestines burning. And then hack the body open, the quartering, probably using an axe. Take out the heart, cut it out, show it to the crowds. Now, the heart would still be beating. Wallace, by now, would be brain dead. Crowds wouldn't know this. They'd see the heart beating because the heart will go on, after brain death, will go on beating for several minutes, perhaps even up to half an hour. Well-known phenomenon.
Wallace's head was displayed on London Bridge. The 4 parts of his dismembered body were sent to Berwick, Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Stirling, the scene of his greatest triumph, to warn the Scots. And that should have been that. At 35, Wallace had died a failure. His reputation as a military genius had been smashed after just 9 months. Then for the next 7 years, he'd been powerless to stop Scotland falling under Edward's rule. But like many heroes who die young, his death sealed his immortality. It's Wallace's legacy that's his lasting achievement. Wallace's execution inspired Robert the Bruce to take on his mantle. 9 years later, Bruce invoked Wallace's spirit before the decisive Battle of Bannockburn, which established the independence that Wallace had so long fought for. Almost 5 centuries later, Robert Burns, who was brought up in the same forests where Wallace used to hide out, was inspired by Bruce's tribute. He wrote Scots Wha Hae. It's become Wallace's anthem, a symbol of what he represents.
From Bruce's often led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory.
When the foundation stone of the Wallace Monument at Stirling was laid, 70 or 80,000 people turned out in the day to see it. So it meant something to people, even back in the days when Scotland was seen as North Britain. And any time that Scotland's future has been called into question, Wallace's shadow is there.
A lesser man might have simply given up, but Wallace went on trying, admittedly not very successfully, but he remained absolutely consistent to that Scottish cause. And I think, therefore, it's hardly surprising that this man has become a symbol of Scottish nationalism in an utterly justifiable way.
He is crucial to the Scottish psyche and to how the Scots have felt about themselves, and he is the symbol of unadulterated Scotland. It's a very macho symbol, I have to say. I sometimes wonder what we women really feel about Wallace, but he's very important as being somebody that we can look up to with no trace of having had any truck with England.
But as a man of the people, Wallace came to represent personal freedom as well as Scottish independence. This is the Wallace Stone at Falkirk, where Wallace is said to have spied on the English. Miners in Scotland used to be bondsmen. 200 years ago, the local miners, released from their serfdom, started a tradition which lasts to this day, of marching here in the name of Wallace to affirm their status as free men. I came to Scotland in search of a national hero, but the man I found was much more complex and ambiguous than the well-known legendary character with his deeds of daring do. Of course, Wallace was a man of his time. He was a brutal man in a brutal age. But his absolute insistence that no man or group should be able to dominate any other against their wishes makes him, for me, not just a Scottish hero, but a universal one.
I'm walking down what used to be the Great North Road, the medieval version of the M1. And this was one of the most difficult and dangerous stretches because it was bandit country, Sherwood Forest. Now, there can't be many characters from history who you can immediately identify just by saying a place name, but already I'm absolutely confident that all of you will realise this is going to be a programme about Robin Hood. Everyone knows his story. He's one of the most famous people in history. But what was he really like? Did he actually exist? I'm going to try and establish whether the most celebrated outlaw of all time was just a comic book character or a flesh and blood historical figure.
I've always had a fascination with Robin, so this is something of a personal quest. We all feel we know the famous outlaw, but he comes in a host of shapes and sizes. The pictures of him we've all had since childhood may be a long way from the real truth.
In the Dictionary of National Biography, Robin Hood is the only figure who didn't exist. He certainly robbed from the rich, but he never got round to giving to the poor.
1,000 men could not find an outlaw if he didn't want to be found in the Sherwood Forest.
Some years ago, I wrote a children's series called Maid Marian and Her Merry Men. It parodied the Robin stories we all know from TV and the movies.
So, who'd have thought it? Robin Hood and his team of mastermind finalists.
But what we think of as traditional isn't. Our modern Robin story is the product of centuries of change and evolution. The Robin we know today is Robin of Locksley, who returns from the Crusades to find his lands have been stolen by evil Prince John and his henchman, the Sheriff of Nottingham.
It's Master Robin.
He flees to the Greenwood and fights on with his merry men, stealing from the rich to give to the poor.
You two go round by the far bank and we'll meet up at the log bridge.
Right.
He marries his sweetheart Maid Marian and gets his lands back only when King Richard the Lionheart returns from the Holy Land. It's a great story, but a red herring as far as tracking down a real Robin goes.
If we want a flesh and blood Robin, then we're going to have to look for the original Robin stories in their earliest versions.
The earliest Robin stories were ballads handed down by word of mouth. We know they were around in 1377. By investigating these original stories, we should be able to find evidence of Robin's real identity.
would be of free-born blood. I shall you tell the good yeoman. His name was Robin Hood. Robin was a proud outlaw, whilst he walked the woodland.
This earliest fiction is just as exciting as our modern versions, but it doesn't offer any clues about how Robin became an outlaw. The tale opens abruptly at his camp. Robin's there with only 3 of the usual suspects: Little John, Will Scarlet, and Much the miller's son. They're preparing a meal. Robin's hungry, but he won't eat until he has a guest. He sends his men off to lie in wait by the Great North Road and catch a fellow diner. They don't have to wait long before they waylay a threadbare knight. Of course, it's a racket. Robin offers the knight his hospitality, and then, once he's eaten, tells him he's got to pay for his meal. But it emerges the knight's penniless. His son has killed a man. In order to pay a heavy fine, the knight's taken on a vast loan from the monks at St. Mary's in York. Unless he repays the debt tomorrow, he stands to lose everything he owns. Because the knight's been honest, Robin sends him on his way with £400 to pay the debt, trusting that the Virgin Mary will pay him back. On top of that, he gives the knight a new set of clothes and a good horse, and sends Little John to accompany him to York as a valet. When you read the ballad, you start to notice that it's very different from the version we know today. Robin here isn't a nobleman. He and the outlaws are yeomen, low-born freemen. But most obvious is the setting. It's not Sherwood Forest.
This is where the poem's set, in the forests traditionally known as Barnsdale in South Yorkshire. Yes, Robin Hood was a Yorkshireman.
People perhaps will be surprised that Robin Hood's a Yorkshireman, but it depends on the background. Historians have known this for a good few years. The problem is that other outlaws, perhaps living down round Nottingham in Sherwood Forest, their stories will be amalgamated with the original ballads, which do come from this area. And the fact that Nottingham is a much better known place than Wentbridge or Barnsdale, which most people, to be frank, have never heard of outside the area, would help the Nottingham connection.
The ballad's very specific about the area. This track is the remnant of the Great North Road as it dipped down into Barnsdale to cross the River Went at Wentbridge. Today, the A1 bypasses Wentbridge half a mile to the east, and it's where the viaduct is now that the merry men laid their ambush.
This is the spot where Little John and Will Scarlet lie in wait for the knight in the poem. Robin sends them to sail to spy on Wentbridge. You can see just beyond those white buildings the road snaking down into Wentbridge from the other side of the valley. The writer knew this place. He knew it was the perfect lookout point. It may surprise some people to hear the Robin Hood stories coming from here and not from Sherwood, but 6 centuries ago it wouldn't have raised an eyebrow. The phrase Robin Hood in Barnsdale stood was a legal saying, meaning that something was a well-established fact.
And a couple of miles down the A1 from Wentbridge, there's further proof of Yorkshire's claims. This is Robin Hood's Well near Skelbrook. Or rather, it's the cover that the 18th century architect Vanbrugh designed for it. The landmark's been moved to make way for the dual carriageway, but for centuries people have stopped here to celebrate Robin Hood.
This is the earliest known place name that's associated with Robin Hood. But over the next 3 centuries, the name starts cropping up all over the place. Robin Hood's Bay near Whitby, Robin Hood's Butts in Cumbria, Robin Hood's Walk in Richmond, Surrey. Practically everywhere except Sherwood. The first name there doesn't appear until the year 1700. They're jumping on the bandwagon at least 4 centuries after the event.
So we've got tales set in Barnesdale, not Sherwood. Robin's not a dispossessed nobleman, but a low-born Yorkshireman. What else do these original stories tell us about him?
Then spake that gentle knight, to Little John gan he say, tomorrow I must to York town, to Saint Mary Abbey.
The abbot and monks of St Mary's Abbey in York are hoping that the knight will fail to show up. They're loan sharks. The knight's only got until sunset to repay his vast debt. After that, they can claim all his property and land.
Disheaded shall he be.
But in the nick of time, the knight arrives. Expecting him to be empty-handed, the abbot shows him no respect and leaves him kneeling like a servant. He gets a shock when the knight hands over the full £400 of his debt. It seems as though everything's square, but there's a twist. Back in the Greenwood, Robin sends his men out on a carbon copy of their first ambush. Lo and behold, this time their dinner guest is none other than the monk from St Mary's. Unlike the knight, the monk pleads poverty, but is found to have £800 with him. The knight told the truth and was helped, the monk lied and lost everything. Justice prevails, and Robin doubles his money. But there's no mention of giving to the poor. Our heroes are just a bunch of highway robbers.
Can you imagine any Yorkshireman robbing the rich to give to the poor? He almost certainly robbed the rich and kept it. That was a product of a much later version.
The Robin of the ballads is a bit of a thug. In one poem, he kills a man, puts the head on his bow staff and mutilates the face.
The original Robin Hood is a pretty vicious character. But then again, in the Middle Ages, when people were being entertained by the early ballads and stories of Robin Hood, they would expect to find a vicious character as their hero, because in those days, everyone was used to living a pretty hard life. So just because somebody went around lopping people's heads off, stealing from people, as long as he went around killing the people they didn't like, it didn't really matter how he did it.
But why does Robin pick on men of the cloth in particular?
St Mary's really exists. It's here in York. But don't be fooled by these romantic ruins. It was more than just a religious institution. York was the second most powerful political centre in the country, and the monks who ran abbeys like these were politicians and captains of industry, as well as being in charge of the spiritual welfare of the country.
The abbeys of northern England controlled the wool trade. The money was supposed to be a means to an end, supporting a life of prayer, but wealth had led to sleaze. In Robin's day, religious communities were notorious for their greed, lax morals, and hypocritical lifestyle. Conversely, Robin's portrayed as fair and truly religious. He may be a criminal, but his rough justice restores true values.
When Robin mugged the monk from St Mary's, a great cheer would have gone up. This ordinary bloke Robin was striking a blow for justice and true religion. Everyone knew the system was rotten. Only an outlaw would have dared do anything about it.
So far, this original version of the Robin stories has given us a good general picture of the sort of hard-bitten character we're looking for. But we'll be getting more clues about his actual identity when he comes face to face with his arch-enemy, the Sheriff of Nottingham. To find the facts about the real Robin Hood, we've been looking at the earliest fictional versions of his legend. These medieval tales explode the myth of a penniless nobleman in Sherwood in favour of a much tougher out-and-out criminal based in Yorkshire. But the stories in these ancient texts also contain evidence pointing us to a real flesh-and-blood historical Robin.
Little John, good scathemog, were archers good and free.
Robin and his men are brilliant archers. The the Sheriff of Nottingham organises a competition to trap them.
Archers fair and good.
Despite wearing their hoods, the Sheriff knows that whoever splits the wand to win must be an outlaw.
They cried out on Robin Hood, and great horns gan they blow. Woe worthy treason, said Robin Hood, full evil power.
Of course, he never succeeds. The outlaws always escape in the nick of time. There's chases, fights, escapes from prison, and then the feud with the Sheriff climaxes in a showdown. Robin takes down his arch-enemy with a single shot, then moves in for the kill, beheading the Sheriff with his sword.
He might have arise on his feet. He smote off the Sheriff's head with his bright brand. Robin beheld our comely king wistfully in the face. So did Sir Richard.
Next, King Edward himself comes to sort out these rebels in the north. With his men disguised as monks, he deliberately gets captured in the forest. But when he sees that Robin's a loyal subject, he forgives the outlaws and takes Robin into his service.
My lord, the King of England.
Which leaves us with a puzzle. The modern Robin stories set in the reign of Richard the Lionheart. The evidence in the ballads suggests this is all wrong. The ballads say that Robin met an entirely different king, Edward the Comely King. Now, there have been 8 King Edwards who've ruled Britain through the ages. The first mention of the ballads is in the year 1377, so that rules all these kings out because Edward IV didn't come to the throne until the 15th century. So, using this logic, Robin must have been around between 1274, when Edward I comes to the throne, and 1377, when we get that first mention of the ballads. And there's another blindingly obvious piece of evidence that supports that dating. It's the one thing more than any other that Robin Hood's famous for.
It's the rise of the bow, the longbow as they call it nowadays. It began to take off 12th, 13th century. That's when it's got to have permeated through the villages and through the towns and begun to become ingrained into our communities and become basically your common man's religion for sport.
In Richard the Lionheart's reign, the bow was a minority weapon. There was no cult of the longbowman. Edward I, II and III made the bow a key part of their military strategy. Archery was compulsory for every able-bodied male, and so being a great archer was like being a football star today.
If you got the eye and the strength and you could do the business with the bow, you were really one of the best in the community.
Robin the crack marksman could only be a product of this culture in the early 14th century, and closer examination of the ballads leads us to an exact date.
Historians have looked closely at the lives of the 3 Edwards who are potential candidates to be our comely king, and they've come to the conclusion that only one of them could possibly have come face to face with an outlaw in this area. In the year 1323, Edward II went on a tour of the north, ending in Nottingham, because of a political crisis that started here, at Pontefract Castle.
Pontefract in West Yorkshire was confusingly home to Thomas the Earl of Lancaster, the cousin of Edward II. The king was unpopular. Lancaster decided to make his own bid for the throne. He called up his men from Yorkshire and Lancashire to form an army. But as they moved out of Pontefract, Edward ambushed them and crushed the rebel. The Earl of Lancaster was tried and beheaded. His followers were outlawed and fled for their lives to places like Barnesdale. The Lancastrian revolt provides a plausible explanation as to why Robin and his men would have been outlaws. It also connects Robin to Nottingham through the villain of the piece. The period of the revolt was the only time that the Sheriff of Nottingham was also responsible for Yorkshire. He'd have been the king's right-hand man in fighting the rebels. The Lancastrian rebellion also explains another puzzle. The poor knight who Robin originally held up is a recurring character in the stories. When the outlaws are fleeing from the sheriff, they run to his castle for protection. The knight's name is Sir Richard of the Lee, and this is where the ballad says he was from, Lee in Wyredale. But this is Lancashire, several days' ride from Barnesdale, where Robin's based.
At first glance, it seems pretty implausible to have a leading character from so far away, but actually it makes perfect sense. Plumpton and Wyredale are linked with Barnesdale through the lands of Thomas Earl of Lancaster. They formed a corridor right across the Pennines, allowing for easy communication between rebels here and here.
A knight based in Wyredale would have been brother-in-arms to a yeoman outlaw in Barnesdale. The Lancastrian revolt is the only time and place where the ballads fit with political history. When historians realised this, they set about the task of finding a real Robin Hood from this period in the medieval archives.
Today, if you wanted to track me down, you'd probably try looking in the telephone book, and there among all the Robinsons, you'd be bound to come across a Tony. But whether or not it was this Tony Robinson, you'd be hard-pressed to know. And in the early 14th century, it would be even more difficult, because the court rolls and the church records of the early Middle Ages weren't catalogued. There were no indexes, and no one was written down in alphabetical order. Nevertheless, lo and behold, when historians were looking for Robin in the early 14th century, they found one. In the court rolls of the Manor of Wakefield in the reign of Edward II, living with his wife Matilda was a tenant called Robert Hood.
To most people, that's not Robin Hood, that's a totally different name, but it isn't. Robin is a nickname for Robert. For many years, the name Robin was used instead of Robert, just like, for example, Jack might be a nickname for the name John, hence John F. Kennedy is Jack Kennedy. So this man is called Robin Hood.
Let's suppose for a moment that this is the real man behind the Robin of the ballads. Robert Hood was a forester. He's one of the Lancastrian rebels who are outlawed after the rebellion. As a result, he loses his property in Wakefield. And the property was here. Robert Hood's house was in Bick Hill. Today, it's the site of the bus station.
And 102.
Our Robert Hood, who lived somewhere under the number 49 stop, disappears in 1322. We don't hear of him again, but it's not quite the end of the story.
Alas, then said good Robin.
The ballad says Robin was taken into the king's service, but after 15 months he was so depressed that he left to return to his former life.
If I dwell longer with the king, sorrow will be slain.
The record tells us that a year after the Lancastrian revolt, there was still political unrest. The king set off on a tour of the north, offering an amnesty to the outlaws, some of whom he took into his own ranks. Enter our second candidate. This is Robin Hood, a valet de chambre, a bodyguard, who appears on the payroll at Edward II's court in 1323, but the following year takes a lump sum of 5 shillings because he can no longer work. When you compare the stories with the history, the parallels are striking.
Let's recap. The ballad tells us that the king forgave Robin Hood of his crimes, that Robin went to work for him, but he left the king's service a year or so later because he felt fed up and depressed. And the records tell us that this man, Robert Hood of Wakefield, fought in the Lancastrian revolt and disappeared, but that shortly afterwards this man crops up, Robin Hood, a king's servant, who works for the king for about a year, and then he too disappears. Could these two men be the same person?
Our Robert Hood of Wakefield was a forester. He'd have been well equipped for life as an outlaw in the forests of Barnesdale. At Papelwick Church in Sherwood, there's a medieval forester's grave that gives us an idea of the essential forester's kit. There's a bow and arrow, of course, and this, a sort of shoulder strap with a horn hanging from it, is, I have to tell you, a baldric. But living out in the forests required more than this. Near the church, I learnt just how tough life on the run could be. At the cave known as Robin Hood's Stable, I met a man who's made a point of surviving in the forest using only the tools of the Middle Ages.
What were the biggest problems?
The rain one night. It rained very, very heavily one night. I resolved it by actually getting into an oak tree and sleeping inside the oak tree, not far from here.
What equipment have you got?
The basic equipment. You have to carry your home on your back, really. This is a flask, because water is very hard to find. This is a cup made from an ox horn, a blanket for wrapping yourself up in at night, an antler for digging a hole to go to the toilet in, and toilet paper hangs on the trees, an axe for making a woodland shelter, and in here, necessities and a few little luxuries, some eating utensils, some salt, some flour, just a basic kit. In terms of weapons, a yew-bow, simple yew-bow in a hunting case. These are hunting arrows, a knife to eat with, a knife to kill people with.
So you've got a hunting horn there?
It is. It's very important to maintain communications in the forest. This was the medieval equivalent of Robin Hood's mobile phone.
So, might Robin Hood really have gone da-da-da-da-da-da-da?
You can try.
So, disappointingly tuneless outlaws. And there's one more surprise in store if you're still clinging to the image of the merry men living out in the greenwood.
They probably went home in winter. This place is particularly inhospitable in bad weather. You can imagine what it's like in January. You would die if you stayed out overnight here in January. And so they almost certainly went home.
So, we have a plausible if surprising candidate for our real Robin Hood. A yeoman Yorkshireman living as an outlaw during the summer and sneaking back to his home with his wife Matilda here in Wakefield in the winter. But every outlaw needs his gang. Next, we have to find the real merry men. By matching the clues in the earliest stories of Robin Hood with historical records, we found a candidate for the real Robin Hood, Robert Hood, who lived in Wakefield until 1322 when he fled to the forests of Barnsdale. Can we also find real versions of the merry men who could have been in league with Robert of Wakefield? Here again, the earliest version of the story doesn't have the outlaw band we know today.
We have Little John mentioned with Robin from the very beginning, and then a few others, Much, Wool Scarlet, Friar Tuck comes in later. And so in a lot of the early ballads you have Robin and a very small group, which is very credible for outlaws. Real outlaws, it was usually the leader, his younger brother, a cousin and someone from the same village who'd also got into trouble. That's realistic. And I think it is perfectly possible that there may have been, folk from Nottingham, Yorkshire, wherever else, who had those names who were outlaws.
So what evidence do we have about the outlaw's real identity?
I was on this bridge first, and I intend to cross first. What do you carry that staff for? Just to make yourself look like a bold fellow, or do you know how to use it?
We all know Little John as the giant who joins the merry men after fighting Robin on a bridge. But in the earlier stories, there's no fight, and John plays a much more central role.
For ye have scarlet and green, maester, and many a rich array. There is no merchant in merry England so rich.
It's actually Little John who starts the whole feud with the sheriff. His relationship with Robin is much more democratic than in our modern version. Little John isn't afraid of telling Robin what to do.
And look well meet Little John took none other measure.
The tourist tradition about Little John is that he's buried in Hathersage in Derbyshire, so people assume he came from there. But the ballads say he comes from Holderness near Beverley in Humberside, and Little John is just an alias. His real name is Reynold Greenleaf.
I withal of my name. Men call me Reynold Greenleaf,
We've got records from 1318 and 1323 of John the Little being charged with crimes in Wakefield and Beverley. It could be that Little John was already a criminal who joined Robert Hood of Wakefield in Barnesdale after the Lancastrian revolt. As for the other outlaws, we don't have a record of Much the Miller, but there are some fascinating clues about Will Scarlett's identity.
Will Scarlett's an odd name because in the earliest texts he seems to have the name of Scathelock or Scathlock, perhaps in a northern form, and Scathlock seems to mean lock smasher. He's a break-and-entry merchant. In some recent versions, Will Scarlett has got dressed in scarlet. You know, he's very elaborate, and I don't think that's what they had in mind.
And yet again, there's evidence of a Will Scathlock at the right time and place who could have known Robert Hood of Wakefield. He was a monk from the very St Mary's in York that's mentioned in the ballad. We don't know why, but he was thrown out of the abbey at the end of the 13th century. If this real Will Scathlock harboured a grudge against St Mary's, it would help explain why the abbot ended up as a villain in the story.
Then we come to some really disappointing news. Robin Hood may have had a wife, but it wasn't Maid Marian. The early versions of the story don't have any love interest in them at all. Marian comes into the tradition in a completely different way.
Every year at Whitsun in the Middle Ages, the workers used to have processions and plays to celebrate the coming of summer. We still have the remnants of this tradition preserved in Morris dancing and mummers' plays. Robin was one of the main characters in these revels, which were riotous and disruptive.
I can see he likes food.
Among the other characters,
By
there
the
was a
size of
Marian
his belly.
too, and over time she became Robin's partner.
And it
The
seems
Robin
he
and
likes
Marian
drinking.
characters used to force revellers to give money for good causes, which is where we eventually get the tradition of robbing from the rich to give to the poor. As Robin changed from bandit to nobleman in Tudor times, Marian was brought into the stories.
Marian appears in full form when Robin becomes gentrified. When Robin is a lord, yes, of a lady, and she appears in 1598-99 in Anthony Munday's play, The Downfall of Robert Earl of Huntingdon, and the second one, The Death of Robert Earl of Huntingdon.
But even here there's a link. In the play, she assumes the name Marian as an alias to conceal her real name, Matilda.
Interestingly, Robert Hood of Wakefield, his wife, Matilda, is recorded as having fled with him into the forest to join in the struggle. Now, that is what Maid Marian is supposed to do in the popular legend of Robin Hood. So Robert Hood of Wakefield's wife, Matilda, matches very much the Maid Marian profile.
Marian's a later addition. There's only one woman recorded in the early stories. She was a nun, and she'd be Robin's nemesis.
This is the Three Nuns pub on the road between Huddersfield and Dewsbury. There's been a hostelry here for over 700 years, and it gets its name from the shenanigans that were rumoured to be going on between the guests and three of the local nuns from nearby Kirklees Priory. If the ballads are to be believed, the guest house that would have once stood here would have been the last place that Robin ever saw before the priory gates closed behind him and he went unwittingly to his death.
After leaving the King's service, Robin lives on in the Greenwood for 22 years. Then unwittingly, he goes to his cousin, the prioress at Kirklees Priory, to be bled for his health, as they did in the Middle Ages.
I must to Kirklees, crafted.
The story gives no motive, but this nun betrays Robin and leaves him to bleed to death.
Through their false claim.
And a later story says that Robin fires one last arrow through the window and asks to be buried where it lands.
Christ have mercy on his soul that died on the rood, for he was a good outlaw and did good.
Kirklees Priory was dismantled by Henry VIII as part of his dissolution of the monasteries. The only sign of the actual priory today are the odd stone and bumps in the ground. The guest house where Robin is said to have died still stands. Although there's no record of how Robert Hood of Wakefield died, it's possible that he was the person who was killed here. Kirklees is only 10 miles from Wakefield, where Robert Hood lived, and the relevant dates link the original stories with historical fact. The ballads tell us that Robin Hood was killed by a relative who ran the priory here 22 years after leaving the king's service. Dating from the time of Edward II's visit, that would be about 1346 or 7. And the records tell us that in 1346, the prioress here was Elizabeth de Stanton, none other than the cousin of Matilda, Robert Hood's wife.
This is the room in which Robin is said to have died. The spot marking his grave's up there, but the business about the arrow can't be right. It's 650 yards away and uphill, almost twice the longbow range for a skilled archer.
It's generally accepted that Robin being buried where his arrow lands is a piece of poetic elaboration round the original simple story of his death. The site of Robin's grave at Kirklees has been a place of pilgrimage for centuries, but if you expect a nice simple ending, you're going to be disappointed.
Searching for Robin Hood's a bit like being the Sheriff of Nottingham. The moment you think you've got him, he slips through your clutches. This is the site of Robin Hood's grave, except it isn't. The site's been moved at least 3 times, and this is what Robin's gravestone looked like, according to a sketch from the year 1665. But it disappeared, and a replica was made, and it was chipped to pieces by 18th century canal workers who thought that a little bit of Robin Hood's gravestone would cure their toothache.
When this site was excavated, there was nothing but earth, which isn't surprising if the grave's been moved. To replace the missing grave slab, there's a 19th century inscription in Cod Oldie English to establish the grave's ancient credentials. Even if we haven't found his last resting place, we've built a coherent picture of a historical Robin. Our man from Wakefield matches the clues given in the earliest sources. The Lancastrian revolt gives him opportunity and motive. There's real contemporary outlaws from Yorkshire who could have been his merry men. And Robin Hood was related in real life to characters mentioned in the ballads like the Prioress of Kirklees. But as with the grave, the truth about Robin is complex and fragile. There's always more to him than meets the eye.
Just when we thought we'd found our prime suspect, Robert Hood of Wakefield, 250 miles to the south, historians discovered another man who blew the whole thing wide open again. And this man had never committed a crime in his life.
The earliest ballads about Robin Hood have given us a picture of a historical suspect, Robert Hood of Wakefield, who seems to have ended up working for King Edward after the Lancastrian revolt of 1322. But in all the best detective stories, the neatest of solutions can be upset by a single clue. Suddenly, evidence turned up that pointed to an earlier Robin.
In the Middle Ages, it was the custom to be known by your father's name. So if your dad was a yeoman called Robert or Robin Hood, then you'd be called Fitzrobert or Robertson or Hoodson or Hudson or Hood or, of course, Robinson. But then, out of the blue, a historian discovered a man who'd lived in Sussex in the year 1296 called Gilbert Robin Hood. This was an extremely rare surname and seemed to imply that the name was already known as some sort of nickname. But then more and more people called Robin Hood or Robin Hood started to pop up. But these weren't just random individuals. We know that a very high proportion of them had at some time in their lives committed criminal acts.
There's even one case where the clerk of the court changed a man's surname from Lefebvre to Robin Hood because he was an outlaw. Later, Robin Hood became a common criminal alias. This doesn't mean that any of these men are candidates for the real Robin, It just proves that people knew about him 50 years or more before Robert Hood of Wakefield. So where does that leave our prime suspect? Well, it's still likely that he's the Robin of the ballads, but the ballads aren't about the original Robin. Historians then went scurrying off and came up with another Robert Hood in 1225. He was an outlaw who'd been fined 32 shillings and sixpence at the York Assizes. But there's no record of him doing anything like the Robin of the stories. Randomly picking up Robin Hood-type names from the records didn't seem to be leading anywhere. But there were medieval figures that we know existed whose lives matched the famous stories. They just weren't called Robin. The best example is a story that started with a dispute over the ownership of Whittington Castle here in Shropshire, funnily enough, in the reign of Richard the Lionheart.
In 1197, it was inherited from his father by a man called Fulk Fitzwarren. But a rival lord with better contacts with King John wanted Whittington too. Charges of treason were trumped up, and Fitzwarren was outlawed. For 3 years he operated a guerrilla campaign in the forests of the Welsh borders, and the stories that grew up about him are eerily similar to those we associate with Robin Hood.
Not only does Fitzwarren have a right-hand man called John, he robs people by inviting them to supper and then getting them to pay. He takes shelter with a local knight and kills his sworn enemy in the forest. But when the king comes to the forest in disguise, Fitzwarren is forgiven. Sound familiar? Could this man from Shropshire be a new prime suspect whose name got changed in the course of history?
It's really weird. Maybe there never ever was a real historical Robin Hood. Maybe the stories are just that, a mishmash of old legends. But if that's the case, why bother with inventing Robin Hood at all? Why not just stick with Fulk Fitzwarren and have all the stories about him? Or maybe there actually was a bloke in real life, like our Robin Hood of York or our Robert Hood of Wakefield, who had adventures and then a lot of fictional stuff was tacked onto them. But there is a third possibility. Suppose both the Fulk Fitzwarren stories and the Robin Hood ballads are based on an earlier figure, a hidden Robin Hood who we haven't yet discovered.
The modern Robin Hood story is set in the time of Richard the Lionheart, when Robin is also called Robin of Locksley. Because of the northern connections in the ballads, historians always assumed this meant the Locksley in Yorkshire.
But there's another Locksley, here in Warwickshire near Stratford-on-Avon. And here, the trail leads us to the ancestor of one of the Norman invaders who came over with William the Conqueror.
In 1193, the Lord of Locksley Manor was Robert Fitz-Oda, a descendant of Bishop Oda of Bayeux. Because Fitz meant an illegitimate descendant, it was sometimes dropped, leaving us with Robert Oda, effectively another Robert Hood.
In the time of Richard the Lionheart, he was thrown out of his manor, Locksley Manor, and for a while became an outlaw, because there are records from that period saying that he is causing trouble in the surrounding woodlands. And he was a robber for a while. He was finally given his lands back when Richard the Lionheart came back from the Crusades eventually. And so he does match quite, to some degree, the actual historical Robin Hood from the point of view of the later legend.
So out of the blue, another candidate from a part of the country not usually associated with the Robin stories. But it gets even weirder. The Robert Oda connection comes from a relatively recent piece of research. But there's evidence here in Locksley Churchyard that it may have simply uncovered a tradition that was known before. Lying just to the north of the church, they found a mysterious gravestone. Its design seemed to match the original Kirklees grave slab. Remember, in 1665, the Kirklees stone had been sketched in Yorkshire and had then disappeared. Is this evidence that people were aware that Locksley was part of the story long before the historians?
This is the gravestone. It seems to me there's three possibilities. Either the whole thing's just a coincidence, but that seems unlikely given how similar the original drawing is to what we've got here. The pattern's the same and the dimensions are so similar. Or else this could be a copy of the original gravestone in Kirklees, or else maybe, just maybe, this is the original Kirklees gravestone, which was brought here by someone who believed that this was the real last resting place of Robin Hood.
We've got three historical candidates who together have helped to create the figure of Robin Hood. There's Robert Hood of Wakefield, the Lancastrian rebel. There's our historical non-Robins who've added their touches. And there's Robert Oder, the original nobleman Robin Hood. But there's another angle to the story. And for that, we have to return to Sherwood Forest. Not the usual tourist trail this time. The clues lie in Southwell Minster. When the stonemasons finished the cathedral in the Middle Ages, they decided to leave an exhibition piece in the octagonal chapter house. The highest form of the stonemason's art was to carve leaves in stone that had the lightness and delicacy of nature. And interwoven into the fabric of this Christian meeting house is the ancient pagan spirit of the Greenwoods, the so-called Green Man. Another name for the spirit of the Greenwoods was Robin Goodfellow. Could this Robin be the inspiration behind the mythic hero of Sherwood Forest?
Now, this figure is not clearly associated with outlawry. He's much more associated with nature, because Robin in the original ballads always appears framed in the forest. That's where he is. And then he moves into action and he returns to the forest. And if you want the original Robin Hood, I think he is that figure, you know, Robin of the Wood, Robin in the Hood.
It is perhaps this pagan version of Robin that appeals most to us in the 21st century.
Robin Hood type stories, I think, have been with us since probably the end of the last ice age, about 35,000 years ago. But they've been added to and taken away from since then. Robin Hood that we know now here in Sherwood Forest is not the Robin Hood that we would have known if we were standing here in the 10th, 11th or the 12th century. He's now cast as a preservationist, a conservationist, look after the greenwoods. In those days it was nothing like that at all. It was simply watch out for bishops, archbishops, beat her up, and whatever you do, don't get caught by the Sheriff of Nottingham.
When I wrote my children's series about Maid Marian, I knew I was joining in a long tradition of telling stories about Robin. But until I went to look for the real Robin, I never fully appreciated just how much that tradition has evolved to suit the needs of the audience.
I think Robin Hood is in the process of becoming the secondary character in a feminist set of sagas starring Maid Marian. That's well underway. What will there be then? Intergalactic Robin Hoods? Will there perhaps be a gay Robin Hood? I think it's quite likely that that will happen. The homosexuality of the legend will be interpreted in that way, and one can see good reasons for that. But I guess what's really next for Robin Hood is lots of exposure.
I started my search by trying to find out whether Robin Hood was fact or fiction. And the answer is he's both. There's a whole host of Robin Hoods. There's the mysterious man from Locksley, the Lancastrian revolutionary, the petty criminal, the king's servant, not to mention the countless medieval outlaws who took on his name as an alias in order to try and protect their anonymity. They all lived and breathed. They were all fact. But it took a fiction to make the story great, a legend that could touch us more profoundly than the simple story of one human being ever could. And whether that legend is about the spirit of the greenwood, or the nature of being a hero, or the struggle of the common man, they all create for us a Robin who's fair, brave, heroic, and just human enough for us to be able to believe that in a fairer world, we too might be Robin Hood.
This is a murder mystery. Here in the Tower of London 500 years ago, a crime was committed that was so vile it continues to haunt us even to this day. The murder of two young boys, aged 9 and 12. We know them as the princes in the tower. They were the heirs to the throne. And the killer, it's always been assumed, was their evil uncle, the hunchback Richard III, who murdered them in order to seize the throne for himself. It's one of the most famous murders in English history. Even today, Richard III is seen as the arch-villain of English kings. But I'm here to ask one simple question. Did he really do it? Because behind the cardboard cutout villain, there's a much more complex and fascinating character. Piecing together a murder mystery 500 years on is a tall order, made harder by having to sift the facts from state propaganda. Details of the murder were only released 20 years after the event. This story condemned Richard with a potent mixture of rumour, character assassination and alleged confession. The official version is that Richard ordered his servant, James Tyrrell, to kill them. They were smothered in their sleep, then Tyrrell had them buried in the tower. It's a version that was given some credence when, in 1674, two skeletons were discovered here, at the base of the tower. In the 1930s, they were scientifically analysed. But the study showed only that they were the bones of children. And even if modern DNA conclusively proved they were the prince's bones, it doesn't mean Richard killed them. So there's no smoking gun. Instead, we have to look at the balance of probability, judging Richard by opportunity, character and motive. First, motive. The most well-known source is very clear about why Richard killed the princes in the tower, but we learn this not from a historian, but a playwright.
Now is the winter of our horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse! And murder while I smile.
Shakespeare's Richard III is an unforgettable character, a bitter psychopath, lurching from murder to murder, wife, brother, as well as the princes, all for the same reason. For Shakespeare, the motivation was simple. Richard was a cripple.
Uncle, my brother mocks both you and me because that I'm little like an ape. He thinks that you should bear me on your shoulder.
Richard's hunchback and withered limbs are the most noticeable thing about him. It's the physical expression of the evil within. But Shakespeare was writing over 100 years after the event, and we have to remember who he was writing for. Queen Elizabeth I, the granddaughter of Henry VII, the man who finally overthrew and killed Richard. Here, at the Society of Antiquaries, there are clues that Shakespeare's portrait of Richard is deeply flawed, right down to the humpback.
There was a dreadful belief at the time that wickedness did show itself in deformity. And we all know Thomas More made a lot of it, and what about Shakespeare, what he made of it?
This is the best-known portrait of Richard. It clearly shows his right shoulder to be higher than his left. But Pamela Tudor-Craig, a world expert on the art of Richard's period, has made an extraordinary discovery.
The hump has been painted in.
That's this one here?
This one here. The originally normal back was raised, only a matter of half an inch or so, at some subsequent date, probably very soon after it was painted, and another link of the chain of his collar was added, very badly, to suggest that he was unequal. And it's just enough because this shoulder is very sloping down that way, and it does make an unevenness.
Is it just me, or do his eyes look a bit mean and his jaw looks a bit tense?
Absolutely. And the X-ray that's been made of this, which showed that the shoulder has been raised, also showed that the eyes were not originally so narrow and the mouth not originally quite so tight.
The evidence has been tampered with. Richard has been stitched up. In those days, if you wanted a copy, you had to paint it again. And as copies of this painting were made, the hump got bigger and bigger. And to prove the point, here at the Society of Antiquaries, we have a second earlier portrait, one which clearly shows he doesn't have a hump.
This one hasn't been doctored. The Tudors never got at this one. It was in the country, in Norfolk, picked up in the 18th century, and that's how it got here.
But did Richard have simpler motives that any detective would recognise? Greed, jealousy, or lust for power? Richard III came at the end of 30 years of turmoil known as the Wars of the Roses. Powerful barons with allegiance to the Red Rose of Lancaster or the White Rose of Yorkshire made alliances, toppled kings, and wreaked havoc. Richard's eldest brother, Edward IV, seized the throne in 1461. Richard was just Duke of Gloucester. According to Shakespeare, Richard was jealous and schemed for power from the start, even before the princes were born.
Once again, Shakespeare seems to have got it completely wrong, because there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that prior to Edward's death, Richard was anything other than the most loyal and devoted younger brother.
There was a traitor in the family, but it wasn't Richard. It was his big brother George, Duke of Clarence. In 1469, Clarence rose up against Edward. Allying with powerful nobles, he raised an army and in a dramatic coup toppled Edward from the throne.
Edward was forced to flee to the Low Countries. He took a boat from here at King's Lynn. It's said that he left in such a hurry, he was forced to hand over his fur gown in order to pay the captain. He left with just a small band of followers, but it included the 18-year-old Richard.
It looked like the end of the road for Edward. A new regime was in power. This was the moment when anyone wanting to promote their own interests should have jumped ship and changed sides. Not Richard.
I don't think he was a scheming villain right from the start. I think his most characteristic feature before 1483 is his loyalty to his brother, Edward IV.
The two brothers spent a bleak winter in exile. The following spring they returned, landing just a few miles up the coast from here. But they had with them little over 1,000 men. The odds were still against them. Then Edward made a breakthrough. He persuaded the fickle Clarence to change sides again, to stab his fellow rebels in the back. The tide turned, and with Richard fighting bravely at his side, Edward smashed the rebels. He was King of England, and the House of York was united once more. But Edward never forgot the behaviour of his two brothers during that dark winter.
They say drink can kill, and in Clarence's case this was literally true. 8 years after the failed coup of 1470, Clarence was again found guilty of treason, and this time Edward was in no mood to show any mercy. Nevertheless, as a favour to his mother, he allowed Clarence to choose his method of execution. This is Malmsey wine, what nowadays we call Madeira, and rather than face being hung, drawn and quartered, Clarence chose to be suspended upside down in a barrel of this until he drowned.
Richard's fate was very different. He was rewarded with vast estates in the north of England. By the time he was 23, he was the richest, most powerful noble in the land and the king's right-hand man, a model of loyalty. And when Edward was blessed with the birth of 2 small boys, the future of the House of York looked secure. England had found stability at last, and Richard had shown not the slightest sign of wanting the throne for himself.
We're beginning to get a sense that history may have done Richard III an injustice. He wasn't a hunchback. He didn't betray his brother. At the moment, he certainly doesn't look like the kind of man who would murder his nephews. And I'm not the only person to think that. Incredibly, 500 years on, he's the only King of England with his own fan club. This is the Richard III Society. Each year it gathers at this small country church close to the scene of Richard's death to honour his memory. It has 4,000 members and branches all around the world. Its mission, to resurrect the dead king's reputation.
It's because there's a mystery, people get fascinated by that, and then it goes on from there. And once you start investigating it, you find he's really a rather nice person. It's perhaps a sense of justice, a desire to right a wrong that's done to somebody. I can't bear people who say they're being objective, but in fact are very cleverly putting in adjectives to make Richard sound bad.
Bye. Thank you very much. You're a member of the society? No, I'm not.
Richard was in control of the north of England for 12 years following Clarence's rebellion. It's his positive achievements here that his supporters put forward as evidence in his favour. First, he was a brave and fearless soldier. He'd shown personal courage fighting with Edward, and in 1482 he led a successful invasion of Scotland, recapturing the town of Bury. Next, in an age of corruption and lawlessness, he was fair and just, putting an end to the petty feuding of local nobles.
The North had been very disturbed since at least the mid-1450s. I think Richard does bring a degree of stability and peace to the North that he hadn't seen for years.
He uses his council as a means of arbitration in disputes. That's not new. Lots of other nobles did it, but he did it very effectively. And he continued that as king. He seems to have developed a particular dislike for the bad administrator. How we wish we had Richard III now.
These don't seem to be the actions of a morally bankrupt man. And there's more character evidence to balance the picture of a monster we've been given by Shakespeare. The records show that he endowed universities, gave generously to the church, and paid for masses to be said for the souls of fallen comrades. And it wasn't just a matter of form. He was a pious man who read complex works of theology. The remnants of his personal collection are still held in the British Library. For most 15th century nobles, books were just a status symbol, lavishly illustrated works purely for show. But Richard's books are rather different. For a start, many of them were second-hand. Take a look at this one. It's plain, it's unadorned, it's well thumbed. Richard's even written in it. See that there? It says, R. Gloucester. Richard bought these books for himself, and he bought them to read, not just to stick up on a shelf. None of the evidence so far about Richard's motivation fits with him being the prime suspect in our murder mystery. He was a model brother to the king, and as far as his nephews were concerned, a model uncle. Then, in April 1483, the king caught a chill after going boating. Within a few days, he was dead. Suddenly, everything changed. So who were the princes in the tower? Well, in the spring of 1483, Richard's brother, King Edward IV, died unexpectedly. He was just 40. The crown passed automatically to his eldest son, who became King Edward V. He was only 12 years old. His brother, just 9, had the same name as his uncle Richard, who, as we've already seen, had been a model second-in-command to his older brother. Suddenly, everything was up in the air. It's from this moment the clock begins ticking towards the death of the two princes. Edward's death provided Richard with an opportunity and a motive. And he certainly seems to have undergone a radical change, because immediately he threw off his role as loyal lieutenant and moved centre stage. Edward's son, the uncrowned Edward V, was travelling from Wales to London for his coronation, and Richard immediately rushed south to intercept him here at Northampton.
You've had 12 years of relative peace and stability under Edward IV, and now everything's thrown into the melting pot again. And I think people are really scared anyway when you get a minor inheriting the throne, because that obviously opens up the possibility for political intrigue and factionalism, even if you don't have an uncle who decides to go for the throne himself.
It's now that the evidence starts to mount up. The only proof of Richard's villainy is his conduct over the next 10 weeks. He met first with the young king's guardian, Earl Rivers, who was the Queen's brother. Richard told Rivers he wished simply to join the king's party on its progress to London, to add to the magnificence of its entry into the capital. They drank until late into the night. But at dawn the next day, Richard was struck. Armed retainers burst into Rivers' bedchamber and arrested him. He and other senior advisors to the king were immediately hauled off to Richard's castle at Pontefract in northern England. It was the sort of bold and decisive move which, as we'll see, was about to become Richard's trademark. With Rivers and the others now under arrest, he raced down what's now the A5 to the village of Stony Stratford. This house used to be the Rose and Crown, and there's a well-established legend that it's here that the king himself was staying. Thank you very much. The king was told that Rivers had been arrested because he and the rest of the Queen's family were plotting to assassinate Richard. The young king, just 12 years old, protested their innocence. Earl Rivers, he said, was a loyal subject, but it was no use. Politely but firmly, Richard told the king he would now be travelling down to London under his protection. The two now set off together for the capital. We've got a poignant memento of the few brief weeks Edward V was King of England, and it may even date from that journey. It's an official document signed by Edward and Richard. Richard has added his personal motto: "Loyalty binds me." To us, this motto seems cruelly ironic. But when Richard arrived in London a few days later, it wasn't to a hostile reception. In fact, his seizure of the young king was popular. What he'd done was to wrench Edward from the hands of the Queen's family, who were universally loathed. They were seen as upstarts. Edward IV, it was felt, had married beneath himself. And the traditional nobility resented the power the Queen's family wielded. Far better, the young king should be in the hands of his uncle, a true blue blood. So when Richard suggested that Edward stay here at the Tower, no one thought there was anything wrong with that. It was, after all, where kings traditionally stayed prior to their coronation, and hadn't yet acquired the sinister reputation that it gained in the Tudor age. So Edward moved in sometime in mid-May, and his younger brother followed shortly afterwards. They would never leave again. Richard was calling himself Lord Protector, the King's chief advisor. But if you looked closely at the kindly uncle, you could see cracks in the mask.
He'd already been accepted as the chief counsellor, so the government of the kingdom was going to be conducted under his leadership. And this was quite normal and as expected. However, it wasn't normal in minorities for the protector, as Richard III made himself in the end, to both have the responsibility of the government kingdom and have the custody of the person of the king.
Was he up to something? Did he really have the young king's best interests at heart? If he didn't, there was a major obstacle in his way.
The one man who would certainly resist any attempt by Richard of Gloucester to take the throne is William Lord Hastings, who is one of Edward IV's most loyal supporters throughout his reign, and is probably the man who's most committed to ensuring that Edward V is crowned and rules. So if you're going to go for the throne, in Richard of Gloucester's position, if you're going to go for the throne, William Lord Hastings is certainly a man that you're going to have to take out.
On the morning of June the 13th, 1483, Richard called a meeting of the Royal Council. Naturally, among those attending was the King's Chamberlain, William Lord Hastings. It was like a board meeting. On the agenda, the coronation. No one expected what happened next. He started by pulling the same trick he'd used on rivers at Northampton. He lulled them into a false sense of security. He was relaxed, friendly. He even suggested that they sent out for some strawberries. And he left the meeting for a while. When he returned, Richard's mood had changed. According to one report, he bared his arm, which had developed an infection. He was a victim, he said, of sorcery. The Queen was plotting against him. Then he rounded on Lord Hastings, accusing him of being in league with his enemies. He slammed his fist on the table. At this signal, armed men rushed into the room. Poor Hastings barely had time to splutter a denial before he was dragged off. A few minutes later, he was dead, beheaded on a makeshift block on Tower Green.
We're standing on Tower Green, the village green. I live here, it's my home. It's where I walk of an evening to relax and unwind after a busy day at the office.
Hastings is said to be the first person to be executed inside the tower. It's possible that the two princes might have seen the summary execution. They'd have understood its significance for their own position. Richard had shown his hand, and now there was no going back. It had been a typically dramatic, even reckless coup. But what looks like a man on the make may have been a man who felt deeply threatened.
I think Richard III probably was making a political judgment about his best interest, calculating that if he didn't make himself king in the long run, he'd become a victim of the reign of Edward V. In particular, a fear that he had about the influence of the Queen's family around the young king, Edward V, and the possibility that he couldn't hold on to power.
If you ask what Richard had to lose, it was this. Under his brother, he'd been given vast estates in the north of England, hundreds of thousands of acres. But lands that had been given by one king could be taken away at a stroke by a new regime. There's another possibility, that he genuinely believed he was the rightful king. It's certainly what he claimed at a specially staged event 9 days after the death of Hastings, just a short walk from the Tower at St. Paul's. Richard had already eliminated opposition within the nobility. Now he made a bid to win over public opinion. On this spot, in the shadow of the old medieval St. Paul's Cathedral, stood something called St. Paul's Cross, which acted as a sort of outdoor pulpit. And here, on June the 22nd, an extraordinary statement was made. It was meant to be a sermon, but the crowds knew the bishop reading it was Richard's mouthpiece, and he was announcing Richard's own claim to the crown. What stunned everyone were the grounds he used to justify it, a series of quite scandalous revelations about Richard's own family.
Edward, Richard's brother, had been born out of wedlock, and so had the two princes. This left only one legitimate heir to the throne. At this moment, Richard himself was supposed to appear in one of the galleries of the cathedral to shouts of "Long live King Richard" from the crowd. But unfortunately, he mistimed his entrance, and so was met by stunned silence. As a piece of theatre, it was a fiasco. But Richard had made sure he had backup. Even as he fluffed his cue, an army was on its way south, summoned by Richard from his northern power base. It was clear he was going to seize the throne, whatever anyone thought. 3 days after declaring himself king, Richard executed Earl Rivers and the other men he had arrested at Northampton. Then, on July the 6th, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England at Westminster. But one huge problem remained, or rather two small problems. Somewhere deep in the bowels of the tower, two little boys. Richard had seized the throne, outmanoeuvring the opposition and moving with extraordinary speed and decisiveness. But in the tower, the two princes remained a threat to his power. They seemed to have been more than aware of the danger they were in. The young king, reported a contemporary chronicler, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. Before the coronation, the boys had been seen regularly playing in the grounds, but now the sightings stopped altogether. Edward IV's sons had been disappeared. The princes were taken right into the bowels of the White Tower here, and almost as soon as Richard had been crowned, rumours began circulating that they'd been got rid of. No court would convict Richard on the evidence. The princes had disappeared, but in law that doesn't prove a crime's been committed. The story that Richard got his servant to kill the princes only came to light 20 years later. The bones of the young boys were discovered 200 years afterwards. If the Tudors had the man who'd done the deed, why couldn't they also produce the bodies? The evidence against Richard is purely circumstantial and doesn't sit easily with what we know of his character after he was crowned.
If someone like the Bishop of St. David's, Thomas Langton, who one knows quite a lot about, he was a rather delightful, well-educated cleric. If he says about Richard, God has sent him to us for the weal of us all, I never liked the condition
of any prince has got great thanks of God and love of all his subjects, rich and modesty of mind. Behind whom shall we place our Richard? None. Certainly none.
But if not Richard, then who? Like the identity of Jack the Ripper or the shooting of JFK, there's been a whole host of pet theories and alternative suspects. First up, the Duke of Buckingham. No portrait exists, but he was a slippery careerist who helped Richard's bid for the throne. But if he did have a hand in it, he seems to have regretted it pretty quickly. In the tense months following the coronation, there was a major rebellion against Richard. Buckingham, perhaps feeling the tide was turning, threw in his lot with the rebels. They started by aiming to free Edward V from the Tower, but halfway through switched to supporting a minor Welsh noble, Henry Tudor, a sure sign that people believed the princes were already dead. Henry Tudor would eventually become Henry VII, which brings us to our second suspect, Henry Tudor's mum. The theory is that she had the princes killed as part of a scheme for her own son to emerge as the principal rival to Richard. Murderous or not, that's what happened. But in the end, the rebellion went off at half-cock and was easily suppressed. Henry had to scuttle back to exile in France. But one objection rules out both these suspects, and it also gives us our only real alternative murderer. To kill the princes, you had to get at them. With the two boys locked securely in the tower, only the king has access to them. But which king? Richard was only on the throne for 2 years before Henry VII took over. Suppose Henry, at his moment of triumph, had ridden into London and found the two boys still alive in the Tower, the true heirs to the throne. Is Henry VII our real villain? There's little doubt that Henry would have killed them if he'd found the princes alive. Their claim to the throne was better than his. The Tudor smear campaign against Richard could be just a cover-up. It's a lovely theory, but common sense says it just doesn't hold water.
If they weren't dead, why didn't Richard produce them and parade them through the streets of London to prove they were still alive? And if they weren't dead, or if she didn't think they were dead, why did their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, support a rebellion, apparently, to put Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, on the throne?
Which takes us back to our prime suspect. If this was an Agatha Christie novel, then the murderer would turn out to be the least likely suspect, Henry or Buckingham or whoever. But history isn't like that, and for me, at any rate, Richard remains the most likely culprit. He had the means, he had the motive, and his behaviour since his brother's death had shown a streak of ruthlessness. But there's still one unsolved mystery. OK, Richard usurped the throne and murdered the incumbent king, but in the Middle Ages, that was par for the course.
I think it's probably a mistake to select Richard III for special denigration.
15th century politics was a brutal game. Kings were killed in battle, imprisoned, starved, and in one case gruesomely murdered with a red-hot poker.
It's difficult to find too many 15th century kings who one would really want to spend a lot of time with, in all honesty.
At King's Lynn, Richard had seen a king turfed out of his own country, who needed to be tough to survive. It's probably easiest to think of these people not like our present-day royal family, the Queen and Harry and Wills and Prince Charles, but as present-day mafia dons, with their bands of thugs and their struggles for power. No matter how many people got hurt, how many people got killed, it was just business. Nothing personal. So why pick on Richard? He's the victim of a process of myth-making and legend, and that process began here, in this bleak field. It was here that he met his nemesis, Henry Tudor.
He's the grandson of an illegitimate son, a bastard son of John of Gaunt, who's the third son of Edward III. So he has no claim to the throne at all.
I was going to say that doesn't sound very impressive.
It's very unimpressive.
This second rebellion of Henry's was the last round of the Wars of the Roses, and Henry led it for one simple reason. It was the only claimant to the throne the House of Lancaster had left. Henry had been in exile in France for the last 14 years, and the army he brought to England comprised mainly of French mercenaries. This was a foreign invasion, not a popular uprising. He landed at Milford Haven in Wales on August the 7th. 2 weeks later, he arrived at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard was waiting for him. The battle that took place here on August the 22nd, 1485, seems to divide English history in two. At some time, round about mid-morning on that day, the old, savage, warlike era of the Middle Ages ended, and the enlightened, modern times of the Tudors began. At least, that was the Tudor propaganda. For Shakespeare, Bosworth was a simple morality tale. It's the place where the child murderer got his comeuppance.
Give me another horse! Bind up my wounds!
Shakespeare makes it seem as though Richard had lost the battle before he started. He was haunted by nightmares, he was alone and friendless. But actually, it wasn't anything like that. On the morning of the 22nd, you'd have put your money on King Richard. Henry Tudor, the Welsh pretender, was a rank outsider. At dawn, the two men mustered their troops, and Henry would have been only too aware of the disparity in their forces. His army numbered around 5,000. Richard's was probably closer to 10. And Richard believed God was on his side. He paraded the cross before his men, perhaps this one, which was found nearby many years later. In every way, he had the strongest position.
Henry was down there in that hollow where the flagpole is, and Richard was up here on the hill. So the king had got the advantage of the high ground, and he'd got an army about twice as big as Henry's. But he'd got his problems too. He'd spent an uneasy night. Shakespeare reckons he was racked with conscience. But it's more likely that he was wrestling with practical issues.
Medieval armies were made up of the retinues of various nobles, each fighting under their own banner. And Richard was painfully aware that he was heavily dependent on the troops of one man, Lord Stanley, a powerful landowner from the northwest of England, who also happened to be Henry Tudor's stepfather.
Lord Stanley was a man who'd always managed to be on the winning side, and gradually became a very powerful and influential person, so that most kings needed him on their side, something he was able to use to his own advantage.
So Richard was up here, Henry was down there, and over there somewhere was Stanley with his troops, hedging his bets, waiting to jump in when he saw what was best for Stanley. The battle started at the bottom of the hill when the two vanguards engaged. It would have been brutal and bloody.
Blow for blow, arrow for arrow, the battle raged through the early morning. Everyone knew that time was on Richard's side. The longer the battle lasted, the more likely his superior numbers would tip the balance.
Then suddenly Richard noticed that just over there, to the left of where those farm buildings are today, Henry and a few of his followers had become detached from the main body of the army. His old reckless streak reasserted itself. What if he could kill Henry? He could finish the battle and save his kingdom at one blow. He couldn't resist it. He gathered together some of his most loyal supporters and ordered a cavalry charge, down the hill and straight at Henry. The two forces clashed at a place called Sandyford, which was probably somewhere around here. Richard killed Henry's standard bearer, he killed a second man, and by this time he was probably just yards away from Henry, who would have been surrounded by a mass of French mercenaries. But at that moment, Richard's horse was killed from under him. His all-or-nothing gamble had failed. The attack faltered. Then the final nail was driven in Richard's coffin as Lord Stanley at last committed himself on Henry's side.
Looking up to see Stanley's troops swarming around him, Richard must have realised he'd had it. But he fought on, according to eyewitnesses, screaming in fury at the treachery of his allies. One thing even Richard's enemies never questioned was his courage.
Forget a horse, my kingdom for a horse. One of his men offered him a horse so he could make his escape, but he refused and went down fighting. He was probably hacked to death by French pikemen as he lay writhing in the mud. Then his body was stripped naked, slung over a horse, and then paraded through the streets of Leicester. Thus died the last medieval king of England.
He's the only English monarch without a tomb. They buried him in a nearby monastery. Later, when Henry Tudor's son, Henry VIII, dissolved the monasteries, his bones were dug up and thrown away. It's said his coffin ended up as a horse trough. The Tudors wanted to rob him of all dignity.
One of the aims of Tudor propagandists is to paint a really black picture of the Wars of the Roses as a warning as to what can happen when you have dynastic strife. And since Richard III is the last of the Wars of the Roses kings, and the one whom Henry VII turfs off the throne anyway, he comes in for particularly powerful denigration.
For the Tudors, Richard became a lesson from history. This was what happened when you overthrew the rightful king. But we found the one-dimensional villain presented by Shakespeare is a caricature. The real Richard probably murdered his nephews, but he was far from being the monster of popular legend. And that's where our story might have ended. But then, while we were making this programme, a chance discovery in a French archive turned all of this on its head, forcing us to totally rethink not just Richard, but every royal since. Our inquiry into the murders of the princes in the Tower has led us back to the prime suspect, Richard III. But it was never quite clear what drove him, why it was that the loyal brother of the years before 1483 was suddenly transformed into a brutal usurper. Then, while we were making this programme, a new discovery was made, one which provided an extraordinary answer. It was made not in England, but here at Rouen in Normandy. Richard, remember, based his right to the throne on the claim that his brother Edward, who was the father of the two princes, was illegitimate and shouldn't have been crowned king at all. And it was this claim that was central to the sermon that was preached at St Paul's Cross 4 days before Richard became king. But it's a claim that's always been laughed at by historians until an English historian was rootling around in the records at the cathedral here and came up with a fascinating document. To understand it, we need to go back a bit to the period before Richard was born, before the Wars of the Roses, when England was still at war with France. Richard's father, the Duke of York, was serving with the English garrison here at Rouen. Rouen was the English HQ in France, and he had his whole family with him. Richard's eldest brother, later King Edward IV, was born here in 1442. And the key thing to understand is that Edward only became king because the Duke of York was of royal blood. Mike Jones was just here to research the 100 Years' War when he stumbled across a passing reference to the Duke of York in the daily log of the cathedral. Unfortunately for Edward IV, he was good at maths. It was here in Rouen in 1441 that Edward IV was conceived, wasn't it?
That's right.
So why is this document so important?
This is the cathedral register for the summer of 1441. It tells us the clergymen are being paid for a sermon to be delivered for the safety of the Duke of York going to Pontoise on campaign. He wasn't there at the crucial time. He's not with his wife.
So, even though Edward IV was conceived here, his dad wasn't here?
That's right.
It had to be somebody else?
It would.
It's there in black and white. Here's the maths. Everything indicates he was born at full term. There's no record of him being small or sickly. In the Middle Ages, they didn't understand about 40-week pregnancies, but we know that Edward's birth date of April the 28th means he must have been conceived around the first week of August. The Duke of York was fighting in Pontoise from July the 14th to August the 21st, but the register provides further evidence. When the second son, who was to die young, was born a year later, the register records a massive celebration for his christening.
No expense is spared. The whole cathedral is thrown open, the relics, the choirs singing, the most precious objects are put on the altar. Edward's christening is hushed up. It's in a tiny private chapel in the castle. It's so extraordinary to celebrate the second son with so much more honor than the first. And thus, with the second son, the couple had more to celebrate.
Edward's got to be a bastard, isn't he?
I think so.
The records here back up gossip from the time, because when Richard made his extraordinary claim at St Paul's Cross that Edward was illegitimate, it didn't come out of the blue. All Edward's life, people were whispering behind his back that he was a bastard. What made them so sure was that he looked nothing like his father, unlike his brother Richard, who was the spitting image of their dad. Richard and his father were small. Edward was a 6'4" giant, and Edward's own mother is reported as twice saying he was illegitimate. Up till now, historians have simply dismissed these reports as too incredible. We even have a candidate for the real father. The rumour at the time was that he was an English archer called Blayborn, burly, handsome, a bit of rough. So it may be that Edward IV, rather than being descended from the noble house of York, was in fact the child of a presumably very tall archer from the garrison at Rouen. And if Richard was aware of this, then suddenly we see him in a very different light. If he was the legitimate king, then what does that make the two little boys in the tower? This new evidence suggests they were the sons of an impostor, with no true claim to the throne at all. While Edward was alive, Richard had little option but to be loyal. After all, look what had happened to Clarence. But now, with Edward dead, it was his duty as the only surviving brother to restore the honour of the House of York and remove the corrupted line. Does that mean he killed them?
I think he did, but I think it was a matter of necessity rather than evil, grasping ambition.
Why necessity?
Because they attracted the faction that wanted to unseat the rightful claim and put the rivals on the throne.
And yet it did affect him afterwards.
I think it had a colossal effect on him. He felt that it was an act that he had to do, and at the same time must have felt enormous remorse for what was a grievous sin.
But the Battle of Bosworth meant Richard failed. The legitimate line died out. It was the archer's DNA through Edward which entered the royal bloodstream. Because as well as the princes in the Tower, Edward had a daughter, and she became the bride of Henry Tudor, who wanted what he thought was good royal blood to boost his own feeble claim to the throne. The rogue genes were firmly lodged in the royal line. We started out on a royal murder mystery. We discovered a Richard III who was far more rounded and complex than the traditional image, but who probably did murder his nephews. But we finished by uncovering a far greater scandal, the real skeleton in the royal closet. Anything the royals get up to today pales by comparison, and the consequences reverberate down the centuries. It means that some of the most famous characters in history, like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, shouldn't be there at all. Every single member of the royal line since has been tainted by the blood of the Archer of Rouen. So solving one mystery has left me with another, and it's one that I simply haven't been able to get out of my mind. The monarch's claim to the throne, their right to live in the big house over the road, is based simply on being descended from the right person. But if Edward IV corrupted that line, then who should really be wearing the crown today? Is there someone out there with more royal blood than the present inhabitant? Who is Britain's real monarch?